Chapter 17 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela Jefferies. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Chapter 17. It may be fire, or on the morrow it will be ashes. Arabic proverb. From dawn till dusk, the day of festival had been passed in brief, light-hearted excursions into the desert, sports, and those infantile amusements so dear to the complex Oriental mind, during all of which Zarah had walked amongst her men with Ralph Trenchard at her side. Anticipating the great feast, which would be spread for them an hour after sunset, the men refrained from eating more than a handful of dates whilst drinking innumerable cups of black coffee, so that they moved about restlessly during the day, walking lightly and talking excitedly, with eyes which shone like polished stones. They chased each other like goats over the rocks, wrestled friendly-wise like boys, inspected the cooking pots, and worried, almost to death, the patient, downtrodden womenfolk, whose only share of the entertainment would be the scraps left over from the feast. So mercurial became the atmosphere toward sunset that the men roared with laughter when, laden with a bowl of spicy stew, of which the chief ingredients were kangaroo rat and rice, the fourth wife of Bowlegs slipped on the steps and immersed herself in the succulent mess. They picked her up and in all fun threw her into the river, and stripped and dived in after her, fighting each other for the privilege of saving her, before she disappeared into the cavern through which the river raced. They fought each other light-heartedly. They looked upon Zarah the Beautiful more in the light of a trust from a dead sheikh whom they had loved than their real leader. Superstition and animal magnetism bound them to her more than anything else, and they saw no harm in her marrying the white prisoner for a space, so long as there should be nothing permanent in the union. Everything had been arranged for a happy ending to the day. After the feast, Zarah and her white lover would appear, followed by one of the many bands of the Gwaze Baramik, which are formed from a certain tribe of hereditary prostitutes who wander through city, town, and village, and from oasis to oasis. Following that diversion, the patriarch would arise, clothed in new raiment, to acquaint the white man of the honor which the community intended to confer upon him, incidentally allowing him to understand that, if he liked, he could choose death in preference to tying a tiger cat to his hearthrug. Not that they thought he would for one moment. They knew of the long hours the two had spent together far into the night, of the rides à deux that they had taken in the desert at sunrise, sunset, and in the light of the moon, had seen him clasping the girl to his heart after the passing of the poisonous pestilence only 7 days ago, and, quite naturally, had put their own construction upon it all. Who wouldn't? And knowing as much about the Western mind as their mistress, were just as completely at sea as she. Having seen nothing of Helen since the night when Al-Assad had whipped them into fury with the tales of her ingratitude and mocking, and the other and more interesting things than her death upon their minds, they had ceased to think about her. In fact, if it had not been for the hatred of the womenfolk, which had been roused by the Nubians' tales of her mocking of them, some of them would have quite willingly sent her back to Hutta. They were too well fed, too secure, for hate or love to endure. They worried about nothing, yet a certain restlessness and incertitude caused them to press about Ralph Trenchard when he walked, most friendly-wise, amongst them this day of festival, to lightly finger his clothes, to brush against him, and look at him in the strange, unseeing manner of the Oriental, lost in contemplation. So mercurial became the atmosphere after the feasting in the great hall, where the men filled the vacuum caused by abstinence with highly spiced viands and wines forbidden by the Prophet, that it required but a spark to set their minds ablaze. Replete, they lay upon the floor, chiding and tormenting the elder and more ugly of the women, who ran amongst them with braziers and coffee or with bowls of water for the washing of their hands, whilst the younger ones sped hither-thither in the task of clearing away the debris of the feast before the advent of the mistress they so sorely dreaded. Al-Assad sat cross-legged upon the floor near the steps leading up to the dais. Nude, save for the loincloth, he looked like a giant amongst the men who, barefooted or sandaled, with black or striped kerchiefs round the head, lounged in the long shirt, open to the waist, and bound about the middle by the leather thong, universally worn by the Arab. The patriarch, wrapped in a cloak which added much to his dignity, sat upon a pile of cushions near the first of the columns. Blind Yusuf sat upon the floor against the wall, with his eyes beside him. Following upon the blind man's whisper of Helen's name one whole long week ago, the subsequent and strange behavior of his eyes had given Ralph Trenchard cause to think. The dumb youth would touch him upon the arm to attract his attention, then touch his face, and point insistently at the rock wall behind which Helen lived, and illiterate, as are most Arabs, would shake his head when offered pencil and paper. He had tried vainly by sign to acquaint the white man of the white woman's presence in the camp, a piece of self-constituted diplomacy which would have much displeased Yusuf. The mercurial atmosphere had affected Ralph Trenchard. True, he had not subsisted upon a handful of dates and unlimited cups of strong coffee throughout the day, but Yusuf's whispered words, the youth's strange pantomime, a certain watchfulness he noticed amongst the men, and an extraordinary solitude for his comfort and welfare on the part of Zarah, had well nigh brought him to the limit of endurance during the past week. The novelty had worn off, the salt had lost its savor, and he had determined, poor, unsuspecting soul, as he wanted to make his way to the great hall to witness the dancing to start for Huta within the next 10 days. In one word, everyone was on tenterhooks this festive eve, and ready to fly at each other's throat as any two wild beasts of the desert. The rock pigeons, sparrows, hoopoes, and other birds which abounded in the watery sanctuary in a desert waste, rose in clouds at the ringing shouts of laughter and ribald jokes which the men greeted Zarah's herald. The camp jester, in the misshapen form of a dwarf holding a veritable tangle of black and white monkeys. Following him came 4 handsome youths, carrying gigantic circular fans of peacock feathers, and after them 15 little maids, who ought to have been abed, with bowls of perfumed water, which they sprinkled on the floor. Then the men sprang to their feet and shouted, until Helen, alone, desperate from the solitude of the last terrible week, ran to her door, only to be pushed back, and none too gently, by the surly negress, who longed inordinately to be with her sisters, as they devoured the remains of the great feast. Zarah entered alone, her immense jewel-encrusted train sweeping like a flood over Yusuf's feet as he crept stealthily along the wall and slipped through the door into the night. For an instant she stopped so that the men should fully take in the beautiful picture she made against the flaring orange lining of her train. Her limbs showed snow-white through the transparent, voluminous trousers. Her body, bare, save for the glittering breastplates and jeweled bands which held it, shone like ivory, whilst she seemed to tower, even amongst her men, owing to the mass of black and orange osprey which sprang from the centre of her jewelled headdress. 15 little boys, who too ought to have been abed, spread wide her train as she walked slowly over the wonderful mosaic floor, with all the grace of her Andalusian mother, between the rows of shouting men. She stayed for one moment as she drew level with the Nubian standing like a giant, and, under the impulse of her innate cruelty, looked at him sweetly from half-closed eyes. He raised his hands to his forehead, so that a mark made by pearly teeth shone upon his arm, and looked at her from head to foot, and smiled as the crimson swept her face. Then he gathered the full burden of her train into his arms, and followed her up the 7 steps, and spread it wide as she sat down in the ivory chair, then knelt and kissed her knees and her golden sandaled feet. She leant back and watched the 30 children climb onto the stone stools, upon which had sat the 30 holy fathers centuries ago, and looked down at the hawk-like, eager men who watched her, and up to the star-strewn, vaulted ceiling, from which hung silver lamps, which drew luster from her jewels and her eyes, and the precious stones glittering in the columns. Against the golden background of the Byzantine wall, with the great fans moving slowly above her head, she was barbaric in her beauty, and not for one moment did she or the men doubt that the white man had fallen a victim to her enchantment. She rose when Ralph Trenchard stood in the doorway looking across the hall in bewilderment, and holding out her hands, descended the steps, her great glittering train spread out behind her like an enormous fan. She walked slowly, whilst the men whispered remarks, which were better left unprinted, the one to the other, and the 15 mites leapt from the stools, upon which had stood the prisoners from Damascus, and ran to lift her train as she turned with her hand in Ralph Trenchard's. He looked at her from head to foot. He gazed at the superb figure, the jewels, the beautiful face, the crimson-tipped fingers, and, with all the perversity of the human, was suddenly overwhelmed with a longing for just one glimpse of the girl he had loved, in her riding kit, with her sweet, laughing, fair face turned up to the light of the stars. "Thank God," he said to himself as he walked up the steps by the side of the beautiful Arabian. "Thank heaven this is the end of this awful time, and I soon shall be riding back along the road I came with her, my Helen." He looked down at the men, to find their eyes fixed upon him, and wondered vaguely at the feeling of tension that pervaded the place, then forgot all about it at the sound of a drum outside the great door. With great shouting, and to the shrilling of reed pipes and the throbbing of drums, the dancers burst through the doorway. They had been enticed across the desert by the biggest fee they had ever been offered in a whole of their vagrant life, and had thoroughly enjoyed the blindfolding and the mysterious entry into the strange camp where they had been so lavishly entertained. Men and women, youths and girls, virile, joyous, burned deep brown by the sun and the storm, with the knowledge of life in their flashing eyes, the love of adventure in their hearts, and the call of great spaces in their vagabond blood, they stood quite still for a moment, and then moved. They danced to the sound of the drum, the shrilling of reed pipes, the clapping of hands, the beating of bare feet. They danced in groups, in pairs. One, thin as a lath, subtle as a snake, danced by herself, driving the men well nigh mad, so that the silver lamps swung to their shouting until she dropped in a heap at the foot of the dais. They sang as they danced, until the echoes of the wild Arabian love songs and battle songs beat against the star-strewn, vaulted ceiling. They laughed and clapped their hands in joy, and swayed and rocked to a great moaning. They advanced to the foot of the dais, caring little in the power of their ancestry, which stretches back beyond the days of the pharaohs, for the impervious women who sprang from Allah knew where, or the man who, handsome as he was, came from a foreign land. They danced for 2 hours, danced to earn their huge fee, to amuse, to entertain, to end in dancing for the sheer love of it. In and out of the columns and amongst the men went their slender bare feet to the flashing of knives, the clash of cymbals, and the call of the Arabian love songs. They met, they parted, they met again, whilst the girl, as thin as a lath, as supple as a snake, sprang up and stood upon one spot, moving only from her waist upwards. And as suddenly as they had come, as suddenly they departed, to the rolling of the drums and the reed pipes' sweet shrilling, whilst some of the men crossed to the door to watch them descend the steps, and others got up and moved about, restless under the excitation of the nerves invariably caused by the gauzy Beramik. Followed a certain time set apart for the drinking of wines, forbidden by the prophet, the eating of the sweetmeats, and the lighting of the hubble-bubbles and cigarettes. "You like it?" said Zarah so softly, as Ralph Trenchard lit her cigarette. He bent to catch her words, then drew his great ivory chair nearer still, and leaned towards her as he talked, upon which actions the men who watched put their own construction. "As gentle as the new-born tiger cub," quoted Bowlegs, as he helped himself in right lordly fashion from the heaped-up tray offered him by his third wife, who, being childless, filled the post of drudge to the entire Bowleg family. "As placid as the surface of the sands of death," replied his neighbor, as he looked at Zarah and winked at Bowlegs. Allah grant we split not our sides with laughter when the claws of the tiger cub draw blood, or when he slips up to his neck in the sands of her displeasure. What of the white woman? He ought been prepared for her passing to paradise or Jahannam. By spitting with vigor, Bowlegs managed to interrupt the speaker. My heart is loath to send so fair a maid upon so long a journey. All women who are cats, longing to sharpen their claws upon each other. Let us send her upon the road to Huta, and so trick the gentle Zarah. Nay, yea. Followed a heated sotto-voce discussion, with interludes of gambling instigated by the patriarch, who had grown aweary of this new raiment, in which he found it difficult to find the dice and counters. The gambling spread right through the hall. The men were quiet, watching Zarah as she played every note in the scale of a woman's charm to enthrall the man at her side, whilst he, thinking of Helen, replied mechanically to her questions. And Helen, pale, with great shadows round her eyes, sat on her couch with her hands clasped in a desperate effort to keep herself well under control. For a week she had not been allowed outside the front of her building, nor had she seen Zarah or caught sight of Yusuf among the rocks which towered around her little clearing behind. When she had moved to the door or the windows she had met the negress, who had pushed her back, and none too gently, whilst making sounds of anger in her throat. Her food had become scanty and barely cooked. Her books had been taken one by one. She had been made to understand that to bathe in the river, ride, or visit the dogs, which had learned to love her, was forbidden. When the shouts of laughter which greeted the dwarf with his tangle of monkeys rang through the night air, she jumped from the couch and ran out into the clearing at the back, whereupon, to her everlasting undoing, the negress shifted her ungainly person into the direct center of the doorway, in the front of the building, and lost herself in the great disgruntlement whilst chewing the fragrant coet. Helen stopped dead in the middle of the clearing and pressed her hands upon her mouth. Swinging hand over hand, dropping noiselessly from rock to rock, came Yusuf down the mountainside with his eyes upon his shoulders. 15 feet above her they stood, side by side, upon a narrow ledge, then after a few whispered words, leapt like panthers and landed like great cats upon the sand of the clearing. Noiselessly they crossed to Helen, who stood, speechless, against the wall. In the merest whisper, Yusuf asked her a question and repeated the answer to his eyes. There is no sound as the youth crept to the door and peered in, nor, with his back to the wall and his dagger between his teeth, he stole round the room, his eyes fixed on the surly negress lost in her great disgruntlement. Neither did she make other sound than a little sigh when, struck by fate from behind, she fell forward into eternity with her mouth full of cot. "Quick, Excellency!" said Yusuf, when Helen cried out at the terrible scene. "There is no time to lose upon sympathy. That stroke of the dagger did but remove one who is but a little better than a beast, and a little less evil than she who blinded me. Spill not thy heart's blood for such, but hasten, in the name of Allah, hasten to the white man, who even now is in the hands of the she-devil and my brethren, who know not what they do." "White man? What white man?" Helen walked close to Yusuf and stared up into his sightless face. "White man," she whispered, her face ashen through the tumult of her heart. "What white man? In God's name, in the name of Allah, tell me, is it? Yusuf caught her and shook her as she reeled up against him. "Thou art brave, white woman. Be not a coward now, when thy man waits for thee, surrounded by those who, inflamed with forbidden wine, will strike him down for a misplaced word. It is this wise. In the few words time and fate allow me." Helen turned to his eyes, who stood beside her, smiling and nodding his head, whilst the blind man talked. Then she placed her hand in Yusuf's. "Rush not in, Excellency," finished Yusuf, as they moved toward the door. "Listen to the words of the old man with the white hair and the venerable beard. Wait until the thoughts of thy brethren are fixed upon the white man. Then do as Allah the Merciful bids thee, and may his blessings rest upon thee and thine throughout all time. I shall be within the hall, likewise mine eyes. when he has well hid the body of yon slave and has finished the task I have set him." Yusuf's sandaled feet made no sound. The noise of Helen's boots upon the rocks was deadened by the shouting from above as they sped like deer up the steep, deserted steps to the doorway of the Hall of Judgment. With fingers upon lips, Yusuf slipped in unnoticed, leaving Helen in the shadows, staring across the great chamber to the dais, where sat Zarah, in all her barbaric loveliness, with Ralph Trenchard beside her. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Angela Jefferies.
Chapter 18 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Chapter 18. Upon every misfortune, another misfortune. Arabic proverb. A straight, clear path stretched from her to the man she loved. The end of the room near the door was empty, the men having pressed forward towards the dais so as to watch the white man's face when the proposition, which would amount to an order backed by a threat, should be made to him. They stood on each side, close together, leaving a path the width of the dais, their eyes overbright, and their fingers straying towards the dagger which the Arab ever carries in their cummerbunds. Zarah sat leaning slightly forward, her face white under the tension of the moment, her jeweled fingers playing with the crystal knobs of the ivory chair. She sat in a sea of flaming orange, jewel-encrusted satin, the fans blowing the ospreys of her headdress as they swung the silver lamps above her head. Ralph Trenchard, sensing that something out of the ordinary was afoot, sat right forward, alert, watchful, his eyes following the movements of the men as they walked restlessly to and fro or stood talking with overmuch gesture. He turned at once and looked at Zarah, who sat divided from him by the glistening folds of her train. He looked at her steadily, trying to find the answer to the riddle of the hour, and caught his breath when she stretched out her hand and laid it on his and whispered, "I love you." He sat staring at her, stunned by the sudden realization of his blindness and his crass stupidity, then looked down at the Nubian, who, arms folded, stood looking up at him, a world of hate and mockery in his face. The hate in the man's eyes, the love in the woman's voice, the sense of pending danger, the unaccountable expectation in his heart. Love, hate, turmoil, peace, life, death, which? He lifted his head and looked straight across to the doorway. It showed black, with a background of purple strewn with stars, and he sighed, unaccountably disappointed, and watched the benign patriarch move slowly forward until he stood in front of the dais. As he moved, Helen moved forward and hid behind the velvet curtain hanging to one side of the door, and made another quick movement when the man she loved unknowingly looked straight at her, then stood quite still when Yusuf, without turning, raised his hand. The patriarch had begun to speak. He bowed himself to the ground before Zarah, then stood upright, reminding Ralph Trenchard of a picture of Elijah he had loved to look at in the family Bible, on account of the ravens with loaves of bread in their beaks, little reckoning in his baby understanding that the word raven stood for a certain village, or tribe of people, in the Holy One's environs. The patriarch's fine voice on sonorous words rang through the building, causing the men to press closer still, and the Nubian to look up at Zarah. She looked down at him with a mocking smile, and then at the venerable old man, and lastly at Ralph Trenchard, who sat in amazement, looking from one to the other. Happily, Helen's sharp cry was drowned in the patriarch's sonorous words as he offered the Arabian girl's hand in marriage. With her wealth in cash, jewels, horses, camel, and cattle, to the Englishman. Happily, everyone was too enthralled at the sight of the Englishman's amazed face to look back to the doorway where she stood, her eyes flashing in great anger, her heart beating heavily with fear. Ralph Trenchard held up his hand. The baying of the dogs from the kennels could be heard in the silence that fell, whilst the men tugged at each other's sleeves and surreptitiously made bets upon his answer to the proposition. He repeated the patriarch's proposal word for word, then turned to Zarah, speaking slowly so that all should understand. "Have I understood correctly? Yon old man, who, he says, stands to you in place of a father, proposes that I, an Englishman, a foreigner, should marry you, an Arabian and a Mohammedan, that I should live here with you and help you rule these fine men of yours who could learn nothing from me, that I should give up my country, for which I fought, my people, whom I love, to become one of a nation whose blood is not my blood, nor ways my ways. Is that so?" Zarah's hands lay still on the crystal knobs of her ivory chair as she answered, dull crimson slowly flushing her face. "Verily," she replied, holding up her hand to ensure silence. "It is as you say. It is our custom in Arabia, though of a truth it is not customary for the maid to be present at the bargaining." She laughed suddenly, sweetly, and held out her hands whilst her words beat like hammers upon Helen's brain. "For me, he who stands to me as father offers you my hand in marriage, with my wealth, my people, my horses, all I possess, asking naught of you in return. I have the blood of Europe in my veins. I have learned the customs and the speech of the white races, even of my mother's race. I am not ill-favoured, nor too much wanting in wit. Her voice changed as the song of the summer breeze might change to the warning of the coming storm. "I wait for your answer before my men, who desire naught but my happiness, and with mine, their own." At the veiled threat in the last words, Ralph Trenchard turned and looked at the men, his dominant jaw outthrust, his mouth a line of steel. So this was the meaning of the feasting, the watchfulness, the tension, the solicitude, the horror of it all. Love in the place of friendliness, the love of a despotic woman who had never in her life been denied or thwarted, a veiled threat as lining to the mantle of hospitality which had been thrown about him, a lifelong captivity, or even death, for his freedom if he stood true to his love for Helen. Captivity! He shuddered involuntarily at the thought of some of the prisoners he had seen working under the lash of the overseer's whip. Death! He smiled. A few steps across the no-man's land stretching between the now and the hereafter, and he would see Helen waiting for him, her lovely, fair face alight with the love of all eternity. A great silence fell as he rose, followed by a sound like the wind as the men whispered amongst themselves. "A fitting mate for the tiger-cat, a fitting sire for the whelps, if it were not for his blood." "Yea, verily," answered Bowlegs, "'tis a rare beauty in a man, and a stature of a giant. He and the lion would be well matched in a fight." Bowlegs would have spat in derision if he had dared. "A mouse in the lion's maw, brother. I lay thee my shirt of silk to thy sandals, that the lion would break him in—" The whispering stopped when Ralph Trenchard raised his hand, whilst the patriarch, by force of habit, searched for the counters in the folds of his new raiment. "The honour you do me is very great, very great. I cannot find words to thank you, but—" Ralph Trenchard looked down at Zarah, who rose slowly, a lovely, glittering thing full of apprehension and a rising anger. She looked him straight in the eyes without a word, and, at the relentlessness which shone in hers, he subconsciously wondered what kind of death by torture she would mete out to him in return for his loyalty to Helen. But the word dropped from her lips like the first thunder-drop heralding the coming storm, and Helen, a great light blazing in her eyes, stepped forward, and stopped as Yusuf held her back by a movement of his hand. "But," continued Ralph Trenchard, slowly, very slowly, so that every word could be clearly heard throughout the hall, "the honour, the great honour I must refuse, because under the impulse of a great excitement, the men moved forward in a body, then stopped. There was not a sound to break the terrible silence, not a movement, except for the jewels which flashed as they rose and fell above the Arabian girl's heart, and the fans which swung the silver lamps and stirred the black and orange osprey of her head-dress. She stood like a statue of terrible wrath, outraged in her pride before her men. Like a cobra about to strike, she waited motionless to pay back that insult 100-fold. "Because," she repeated. "Because," Ralph Trenchard said slowly, clearly, "because I love the memory of the white woman who died amongst you, too much to give a thought of love elsewhere." Helen's ringing, joyous cry was lost in the men's shouting and the sharp sound of their daggers as they whipped them from the sheath, and her scream of rage was lost in their shouts of laughter when Zarah, lifting her hand, smote the white man across the mouth. Then she ran, oblivious of the roar of amazement, up the clear path which stretched between her and her lover. "Ra!" she cried as she ran, with arms outstretched. "Ra, I'm here! I'm coming to you, Ra! Come to me!" She ran to him as he leapt from the dais. She was in his arms, and he had folded her close and kissed her before Zarah had time to give an order to the men, who stood motionless with astonishment. A moment of utter silence, then the storm broke. "Separate them!" The order, given to the Nubian, cracked like a whip as Zarah, white with passion, sank slowly into the ivory chair. "Seize the white man!" She flung her order to a young Arab, whilst the Nubian struggled to wrench Ralph Trenchard's arms from about Helen. "Drive them in!" The young Arab turned the dagger he held in each hand and drove the blunt handle hard down onto the ribs just above Ralph Trenchard's waist, and jerked him roughly back when his arms slackened under the shock and agonizing pain. There was a moment's breathless silence. Helen stood perfectly still, her elbows held from behind by Al-Assad, her face, radiant with love, turned towards Ralph Trenchard, who sickened at the sight of the Nubian's glistening skin so near the girl he adored. He knew that they were in a desperate plight, the tightest corner any two could have gotten into. But he was not giving the Arabian the satisfaction of seeing a sign of dismay in his face, and he worshipped Helen for her outward calm, though his whole being revolted at the Nubian's close proximity to her. He knew he only had to make a certain movement to fling off the man who held his elbows from behind, but before he made it, he wanted to find a way to make the half-caste loosen his hold of Helen. And the way came to him as he looked at Al-Assad, who stood staring down at Helen's golden hair with an indescribable look on his face. "You, Al-Assad," he said slowly, pronouncing each word so that it sounded clearly in the hall. "You, nigger, let go of the white woman. In our country we do not allow the black—" He rid himself with a lightning movement from the hands which held him, and sprang and caught the Nubian, who, hurling Helen back against the dais, leapt at the man who had so direly insulted him. There came one tremendous yell as the men rushed to form a ring, then a very babel of voices, as they laid their last Kamish and their last piastre upon the outcome of the struggle between the two men who stood locked in a mighty grip. "My shirt of silk to thy sandals," yelled Bowlegs, that the foreigners crushed like a mouse in the lion's maw. "Taken, O thou little one, with legs like the full moon," yelled his neighbor, who had learned a thing or two in the fine art of wrestling, when he had fought so magnificently for the whites. "The white man will use our brother as a cloth with which to wipe the marks of thy misshapen feet from the ground. Bulk counts not against knowledge." Bowlegs spat as he glanced at Ralph Trenchard, who, trained to a hair, stood well over 6 feet, yet looked like a stripling beside the gigantic Nubian who overtopped him by inches. The men's attention was diverted for one moment when Helen ran up the steps of the dais, and they held their breath in sheer delight when the Arabian rose from her chair to confront her. The two girls were about the same height, both of an amazing beauty, and they both loved the same man, who was likely to have his neck broken within the next few minutes. What more could they desire as an evening's entertainment? "Will you take a bet, Zarah?" The lamps seemed likely to spill their oil as they swung to the men shouting. "Take it, take it," they yelled. "Take it, Zarah the beautiful. Let it not be said that an infidel could show thee a path." "The stakes?" "Ralph Trenchard's life against my locket, which hangs around your neck." "They are both mine." "The locket is mine. His life is God's, in your keeping for a little while." "You, Helen Raynor, you sign his death warrant? He cannot win against my slave." "Will you take the bet?" The Arabian unfastened the chain and, laughing, flung the locket at Helen's feet as the two men moved. The Nubian put forth all the strength of his mighty muscle. Ralph Trenchard, one of the finest exponents of jiu-jitsu to be found anywhere, took advantage of the movement to slip his hand an inch or two and to move his foot an inch or so. For a second he stood quite still. Then, as the Nubian moved, with a movement too quick and too fine to be described, lifted the gigantic man and flung him so that he struck his head against the dais and lay still at his mistress's feet. In the uproar which followed, Helen was down the steps like a bird, and, laughing happily in her complete misunderstanding of the Oriental mind, was in her lover's arms. "His life!" she cried, looking over her shoulder towards Zarah. "His life! I've won! I've won!" Then flung her arms around him and held him close at sight of the fury in the Arabian's face, whilst the men pressed upon them, their hands outstretched, waiting for the order which they knew must come. "Separate them!" Helen's hair came down about her like a mantle as hands, only too willing, dragged her away from the man she loved, and Ralph's silk shirt ripped to the waist as he fought desperately for her until overpowered by numbers. Zarah stood halfway down the steps, looking like some great bird with her train spread out behind her, the ospreys blowing this way and that above her death-white face, with its half-shut, tawny eyes and crimson mouth. She stood looking from the one to the other evilly, as she planned a torture for the two, which might, in some little way, ease the torture of her own heart. She had given her word to spare the white man's life, and, as it had been given before some 100 witnesses, her word she had to keep. But she would make of that life such a hell that the white girl would wish, before she had finished with both of them, that death had overtaken her and her lover in the battle. In the intense excitement of the moment, no notice was taken of Yusuf as he crept quietly through the doorway from behind the curtain where he had been sitting, nor of the clamour from the kennels, which a few moments later rent the peace of the night. "Bring them here, both of them, to my feet. Hold them apart. Thou dog, who told thee to strike the white man?" Zarah pointed at a pock-marked youth who had pushed Ralph Trenchard forward by the shoulder in an exuberance engendered by the uproar so dear to the Arab's heart. "'Tis well for thee that it is a day of festival, else would 10 strokes of the whip have been paid thee for thy presumption." The youth shrank back behind a pillar, whilst Zarah looked from one to another of the men, dominating them all by her unconquerable will and her magnetic beauty. She had but to smile and to speak to them as her beloved children, and the prisoners would be free to go where they pleased, to say one word for the hall to be emptied, to raise her hand for the prisoners to die on the spot. She was supreme in her command, superb in her beauty, but as she looked at the English girl, she knew she was beaten. She could see the love in Ralph Trenchard's eyes as he looked across at Helen, who stood smiling, dishevelled, with her golden hair in a cloud around her over-thin, death-white face. And she knew that in his love for Helen, the love she herself craved for and had failed to inspire, he would fight to the death to save her from harm. Death! Even as the word flashed into her mind, the youth whom Al-Assad had whirled like a club and shaken like a sack of durra for mimicking his mistress sprang forward. In the Arab's supreme callousness towards his brother's feelings, he used the Nubian's limp body as the first step as he ran up the steps of the dais and knelt at Zarah's feet. "Her death, mistress!" he shouted, his eyes blazing at the thought of the white girl's insult towards his womenfolk. "Behold, she mocks thee, and the women who tend and serve her. She mocks them this wise." He sprang back, landing, with the Arab's supreme callousness towards his brother's feelings, full upon the Nubian's back, so that, the last ounce of breath being expelled forcibly from his lungs, he lay limper than ever. Followed a mimicry of Helen's supposed mimicry of Namla the Busy and the surly negress, until the men shouted with laughter and yelled with appreciation, whilst Zarah looked down without a smile, and Helen looked on in amazement. She understood at last, and tried in her indignation to free herself, and, failing, shouted her denial of the untruth. "It is a lie! It is a lie! I could not, would not!" As the youth spat in her direction, and the men, their pride once more ablaze at the thought of the insult offered their own women, cursed and yelled. Ralph Trenchard, with an effort beyond all telling, broke from his captors and sprang straight at the youth who had spat. "You swine, you filthy swine!" he cried, and with a fist like a flail, caught the spitter full on the point, smashing his jaw. Whereupon the men yelled, "Wah! Wah!" and, at a sign from their mistress, shouting with joy, flung themselves upon Ralph Trenchard and held him fast. "Pass not the sentence of death upon him this night, mistress," suddenly cried Bowlegs, waddling forward. "He has grievously insulted thee, as has the white woman. But let him live for a space, and under the eyes of Al-Assad teach us his cunning tricks. For behold, if 'twere but a question of muscle, even I could pinch his life out 'twixt thumb and finger. After we have learned the tricks, then—" A shout of appreciation followed hot upon his words of wisdom. Helen, in despair, fought to free herself so as to protect her lover, whereupon Zarah looked slowly in her direction. "And the woman?" "Kill her! Sink her in the sands of death! Give her to the dogs! Drive her out into the empty desert!" Zarah shook her head at the suggestions shouted by men who are taught in their religion that woman is devoid of soul, and therefore to be looked upon either as a plaything or a drudge, or the potential bearer of sons, and in any case far below the level of the horse at her very best. "Death is but a closing of the eyes in sleep," Zarah translated the line she had learned at school, "and I would keep her wide-eyed in life, working as work the women she has mocked." She caught the horror in Ralph Trenchard's eyes as he looked from her to Helen, who stood mute, her heart aglow in the thought of her lover's safety for the moment. Lost to all thought of self, she but had half understood Zarah's words, and looked questioningly from the men to her and back. "Yea, Ralph Trenchard," said Zarah slowly, pouring the balm of revenge into her smarting wounds. "To work as my servant, to wait upon me, to serve me, even as thou shalt work under the ruling of that fool, who would even now be dead if it were not for the thickness of his skull." She held up her hand as the men shouted. "Has the white man aught to say? The man who changes his coat to the wind? The white woman at dawn, the Arabian at noon, the white woman at dusk, and Allah knows which in the watches of the night." "You liar, you despicable coward! There isn't a word of truth in what you say, you liar!" Helen's words, forcible, if somewhat lacking in diplomacy considering her position, rang through the room, and Yusuf, standing hidden just outside the door, raised the electric torch he held as a sign to his eyes standing outside the kennels, deserted by the grooms, who, against their orders, had crept to the feast en bloc instead of in shifts. Yusuf, who knew his brethren backward and looked upon them as children, had planned the death of the Arabian and the escape of the whites as a grand finale to the day's festivities. For the last half hour, the dogs, headed by Roddy the bitch, had been driven to the point of madness by his eyes, who had drawn one of Zarah's sandals across the bars of the kennels, inciting them to a very lust to kill. Yusuf had planned everything, but had forgotten to take into consideration the extraordinary trait in the character of the white races, which urges them to give their life for their brother at the slightest provocation. He raised his hand to flash the signal, then dropped it to listen to Ralph Trenchard speaking. "There is a proverb in England," he was saying slowly, so that everyone should understand, "which says, 'One man can take a horse to the water, but 10 cannot make him drink.' You will never make the girl, who will one day be my wife, wait upon you as servant. Neither will you make me work under your half-caste lover." Which words were also lacking in diplomacy, taking everything into consideration. A great silence fell. The men thought that Zarah had been rather badly cornered. She waited out of sheer dramatic instinct. Then she laughed until the hall was full of the sweet sound, as she turned and sank into her chair. She had the prisoners in the hollow of her hand, and not one whit of their punishment would she spare them. She put her exquisite golden-sandaled foot upon the ivory footstool and looked at Helen. "Loosen the white woman." She spoke curtly, and the men holding Helen sprang back. "I would remove my sandals, Helen Raynor. Come and loosen them." Helen smiled and shook her head. Torture would not force her to save her life by humiliating the white races. "You will not? Remember, you are a prisoner, my prisoner, and that the power of life and death and punishment is in my hands." Zarah leant right forward and looked into the steady blue eyes, whilst the men, knowing their mistress's cunning, pressed forward. "You will not, you say?" "No, I will not." Zarah sat up, her hand pointing at Ralph Trenchard, her eyes half closed in the strength of her terrible cruelty. "I will make you, and I will make him in like manner if he refuses to obey." She paused for a moment, then spoke sharply. "Take the white man out and whip him until he drops. Stop." Yet, as she leant back slowly, she felt no triumph as she watched Helen swing round to the man who fought to get free. Helen laughed good-humoredly, splendidly, with all the pluck of her race, as she spoke to the man she was fighting for. "Why should I not fasten the very pretty sandal, Ra? Why should you be made to suffer, if my very capable fingers can undo the gold laces of my lady's footwear? Don't get angry, Ra. It's a great waste of energy. Besides, you know I always do exactly as I please." Yusuf listened to the men's exclamations and laughter, to the sound of Helen's feet mounting the steps, then flashed his torch 3 times. "The world is a mirror. Show thyself in it, and it will reflect thy image." Arabic proverb. Helen looked over her shoulder at her lover and smiled without a trace of bitterness, then turned and looked straight into the Arabian's eyes. For a long moment the two girls looked at each other, until, unable to bear the contempt in the steady blue eyes, the Arabian lowered hers and pointed to her sandal, then lifted her head sharply as Helen knelt. Pushing Helen to one side, Zarah sprang to her feet and walked quickly to the top of the steps and stood staring at the doorway, through which could be seen the star-strewn sky, and through which could be heard the baying of dogs in full cry. Her face was white as death, her eyes wide in fear, her hands pressed upon her heart as she backed away from the savage sound, until she stood upon her train, which swept around her like a shell. The men stood facing the doorway, whispering to each other. They had hunted too often with the dogs. They knew every sound of their voices too well not to know that they were hard on the scent of whatever they were so strangely hunting at this hour of the night, when they were never allowed to be at large. Bowlegs, who loved the dogs almost as much as he loved his horses, under a strange excitement which had fallen upon him as well as on the other men, spoke to Helen, whom he knew to be so beloved of the dogs. "They crossed the plateau in a pack, hot on the trail. Ah, they have lost. Canst hear Raddy, the bitch, the finest in the kennels? They near the water's edge. Hearken to the echo thrown by the rock above the cavern. They have found, hunt they the devil? Or'st a pack of gin hunting the dead from the quicksands. Tell—" A man came running from the doorway, his eyes full of fear, his dagger in his hand. He ran up to the foot of the dais and stood, half-turned towards the door, to which he pointed frantically, and shouted up to Helen. "They come, the greyhounds and the dogs of Billy. They mount the steps. Their eyes shine in the dark. They are mad with rage. Death hunts with them." He turned and looked at Zarah, who stood like a pillar of stone, wrapped in her train. She did not seem to count in this moment of great danger. Helen, knowing the dogs' inexplicable hatred of their mistress, turned and looked at her, the contempt in her eyes deepening to scorn as she saw the frozen look of fear in the Arabian's eyes. "The dogs have got out," she said sharply. "Look! Your men are running before them. Look! Wake up and do something. Order the doors to be shut, or they'll be in. Quick, Zarah." The Arabian took no notice. Lost in one of the visions which swept down upon her at times, she was looking into the future. She stood stark with terror, her eyes wide and glassy, her crimson lips drawn back from her teeth, which chattered like gourds rattled by the wind. She shook from head to foot, and put out her hand and tried to speak as the dogs suddenly gave tongue. She clutched at her throat and pointed to the door, and Helen, who did not understand, turned away from the picture of abject fear and held out her arms to her lover, who stood a prisoner in the hands of the men who showed great signs of uneasiness as they looked at their mistress and then at the door. Then Helen stamped her foot and shouted so that the men who stood near the door turned towards her, then impeded each other in their haste as they tried to obey her. "Shut the door," she cried. "Keep them out. Quick, they're almost at the top. Shut it. You're too—" Her words were lost in a piercing scream from Zarah as she ran back and back until she reached the wall. She flung her arms out and fought the imaginary dogs which in her strange vision she saw leaping upon her. She fought desperately, a wonderful picture against the glittering Byzantine wall, fought nothing but her imagination, or the shadows thrown by fate. Then she screamed, and, covering herself in her train, crouched down as the whole pack of greyhounds and the hunting dogs of Billy tore through the doorway. "Rah!" shouted Helen. "Rah, come to me! They're after her! She'll be torn to pieces before our eyes, Rah!" The men holding Ralph Trenchard backed before the onslaught of the great dogs. He seized the opportunity and leapt for the steps, gaining the top just in time. "My God!" he cried, as he watched the beautiful creatures tear across the floor. "If they leap to the top, sweetheart, we're done. They're too mad to recognize us." He put his arm round her and kissed her on the mouth. "Darling, we shall win through. Never you fear. Keep a brave heart, beloved, and remember that I love you." Helen whispered as she put her hand in his. "And remember that I love you, and that Yusuf is our friend." They had no time for more. The dogs were on them. Ralph Trenchard caught the splendid bitch and flung her back as she reached the top of the steps. He caught her again and yet again as she returned to the charge, meeting her teeth in the younger dogs who tried to outdo her or to pass her on the steps, whilst the dogs of Billy leapt and leapt and leapt again to reach the top of the dais, where crouched the woman they hated so deeply in their canine hearts. Yusuf's eyes had overreached himself in letting out the entire pack. They were jammed too close together to get up the steps, or for any single one to be able to get the necessary run which might have allowed the strongest to leap to the top. They balked each other, they fought each other, they rushed the dais in a wedge and fell back and fought each other where they fell, until the place seemed a mass of maddened dogs. The scent of the woman they hated was strong in their fine noses. She was there, just above their heads, just out of reach of their mighty, snapping jaws. They rushed the steps when the bitch fell back exhausted, and fought the man who held them at the top. He knelt upon the top step, and caught them by the neck, and threw them headlong back and down amongst those who rushed behind, whilst those far back in the middle of the hall flung themselves upon those in front, which turned and fought them, then turned again and strove to reach the steps. Helen knelt beside her lover, ready to help, and the men stood far back against the wall, making bets upon the outcome of it all, watching the stupendous picture, full of admiration for the white people who had tackled the situation without hesitation, whilst the grooms flung themselves into the seething mass of dogs and fought to dominate them. And the dogs far back in the hall, who fought to get forward, flung themselves on the men against the wall and on the grooms, then, losing the woman's scent in the male garments, sat back and howled and barked and fought each other until the place was like a corner of hell let loose. Roddy, the bitch, in one last effort of revenge, made a sudden rush, and making a springboard of the Nubian's body, with a wonderful leap, which brought shouts of approval from the men, landed on the top of the dais at Helen's side. With the Arabian scent strong in her pointed nose, she rushed to where she crouched, and turned and ripped Helen's coat as the girl flung herself sideways and caught her by the neck, calling to her, hanging on to her with both hands. The bitch recognized the voice she had learned to obey in love, and turned suddenly and thrust her muzzle into Helen's neck and hands, just as the head groom shouted from the body of the hall. "Whistle, Excellency," he shouted. "The madness is past. They obey. Whistle to them. Then, with thy hand upon the bitch's neck, I beseech thee to lead the way to the kennels." "Yea, Excellency," yelled the different men from the kennels and the stables, as they stood holding onto a struggling dog with each hand. "They will follow thy whistle, loving thee." Helen laughed as she led Roddy to the top step, looking like Diana of the uplands, in a strange setting, as the splendid greyhound strained to get down to her companions. She gave a long, low whistle, upon which every dog fought as frenziedly to get to her in love as they had fought to get to the Arabian in hate. "Hold them," she cried. "I will whistle them back to the kennels." Which words were heard and taken up by a child standing outside in the shadows, and passed on to the women, who, with a hate in their hearts even greater than that of the dogs for the Arabian, had crept from their quarters, and halfway up the steps to the hall of judgment. The hate of these docile creatures for the white girl, planted and fostered by the men who had been so led astray by Al-Assad, was most truly to be feared 100 times more than the instinctive hate of the dogs for the Arabian. They had done their best to please this foreigner, cooking for her, mending her clothes, fetching and carrying for her and waiting upon her. When their men had come back raving of her beauty and her horsemanship, the weak, downtrodden souls who had lost their looks and their figures through hard work and overmuch childbearing had said no word, but when they heard the tales of the beautiful white girl's mimicry of their efforts to please her, then they had vowed to themselves to be revenged upon her, and at the first opportunity. The news of the dog's escape had reached them. The opportunity had arrived, and perhaps a double opportunity for revenge, for why should the dogs not pull both the women down so that they should be quit of their dreaded mistress and the foreigner? When the child passed on Helen's words, they crept swiftly down the steps and up to the kennels, and hid themselves amongst the rocks to wait just a little longer. "No, don't come with me, beloved," Helen said, as she stood on the top of the dais steps pressed close to her lover's side, with the dogs leaping and barking at her feet. "A love such as ours must come right in the end, and I don't believe she meant what she said." In which she was mistaken, as she was to learn. "Then until we meet again, dear heart, I don't like you doing this, somehow." "She wouldn't let us be together, Ra. It's wiser not to make her really angry." He held her close and kissed her, and watched her run down the steps into the middle of the dogs, which nearly knocked her down in their exuberance, and watched her laughing, calling, whistling as she ran down the hall, followed by them all, whilst the men, who were but children in their wrath, and very good-tempered children when left alone, shouted their admiration. She turned at the door, beautiful, radiant, and held out her arms. "Ra," she called, "Ra, beloved," and disappeared into the night, the rocks echoing the barking of the dogs. The men rushed to the door and out onto the broad ledge to watch the wonderful picture. Down the steps and over the plateau and up the other side to the kennels she fled like Diana, preceded by the dogs and followed by the kennel grooms, who called the blessings of Allah upon her as they ran. Her voice, calling to the dogs, came faintly on the soft night breeze. They heard her whistle. There fell a silence. Then were heard the shrill cries of many hate-filled women. The clamor grew louder and ended in prolonged, insufferable peals of laughter. Silence. Sick with horror, Ralph Trenchard took a step down and stopped. Al-Assad sat on the bottom step, looking up. His handsome face was drawn in pain, his lips pulled back from his splendid teeth. He sat crouched, still, looking up out of eyes filled with hate. Ralph Trenchard swung round to the woman. She stood against the wall, a slender, silent figure, love and hate shining from her half-closed eyes. He did not hesitate. He leapt clear of the dais to save the girl he loved from what the insufferable peals of laughter, which echoed in his ears, portended. He had got halfway down the hall when, upon a sign from the Arabian woman, hands caught him and held him, whilst a golden sound of laughter came from Zarah as she stood, a thing of love and hate, against the glittering Byzantine wall. "Fear not, my children," whispered Yusef to his eyes, and Namla the Busy some time later as they talked over the failure of their plans within the last few hours. "Even as the pounding of many grains of wheat goes into the making of bread, so is life learnt in many lessons. Dawn breaketh. To revenge the loss of thy son, my daughter, thy speech, my son, and mine eyes, we will bring about the downfall of the accursed woman. The proverb says, 3 persons, if they unite against a town, will ruin it." End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Zarah the Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zarah the Crow by Joan Conquest. Translated by Thoria. Chapter 19. Before the clouds appeared, the rain came upon me. Arabic proverb. 2 months had passed in which Zarah had absolutely failed to break our prisoner's indomitable spirit. 2 months in which a passion for the white man and a hate for the white girl had grown deeper and fiercer. With the density of some women, she clung with an extraordinary and ridiculous tenacity to the belief that if she only threatened or cajoled enough and held a rival up plainly enough to ridicule or contempt, she would ultimately win Ralph Trenchard's love. Also did fear urge her to force or cajole him into becoming a husband. She knew her own men were blown like cotton threads before every passing gust of their facial emotions, and that their suddenly aroused hatred of Ralph Trenchard had given place to genuine admiration. By that she had come to realize she had no real hold over them, and that, where they had obeyed her father, the Scarehe, through genuine love, they merely obeyed her because it pleased them so to do. She was just their nominal head. She pleased their sense of beauty, and they almost worshipped her for her courage in raids, but they were too well fed, too sure of an unfailing supply of the necessities of life, too secure against intrusion and interference to wish to relieve her of the reins of government with its attendant burdens. If they had formed one of the itinerant groups of Bedouins, which have to literally fight for their existence as they flee across the desert, she knew they would not have tolerated her for a day. True, they made no effort to run counter to her orders and to ameliorate the white man's position. They considered the rough hut he lived in on the far side of the plateau and the rough food sent him quite good enough for any infidel. But they greeted him with friendly shouts when he arrived to teach them his tricks of cunning and did their best to beat him at his own game. If it had not been for his overwhelming anxiety for the future and for Ellen, whom he knew by hearsay to be a very slave to the tyrannical Arabian, Ralph Trenchard would not have complained of his life or his treatment. True, he hated the half-caste, who did his best to humiliate him in the eyes of the men, and in a moment of forgetfulness in the early days, had forcibly rebelled against his constant espionage and irritating presence. He had been instantly cured of the spirit of rebellion by the sight which, with a mocking laugh, the Nubian had pointed out to him of Helen, kneeling by the river, surrounded by jeering women, as she watched the Arabians' linen. And worse will happen, thou infidel, if thou durst disobey my mistress's commands. Muhammad, the prophet of Allah, decreed in his understanding that unto the faithful should be 4 wives given. Neither did he in his wisdom say aught against an infidel wife being of the 4. Nay, in thy eyes I see the lust to kill. The life of the white woman pays forfeit for my life. Thy life if the white woman essays to shorten the days of Zarah the beautiful. For fear of something worse than death befalling the beautiful, splendid girl he loved, he dared do nothing. For every word, for every act of rebellion on his part, some task even more menial than those she daily performed would be forced upon her. For any attempt he might make upon the Nubian's life, to assuage his own outraged feelings, a life would be taken, and there seemed no possible way out. Not only did the Nubian dog his footsteps, but Yusuf, upon whom he had counted in his heart of hearts, had failed him, and without his help nothing could be done. No communication with Ellen effected, no plans for escape made. He saw Yusuf every day, seated amongst the men gathered to learn the art of wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and of all the little crowd he seemed to be the only one who still cherished his hatred for the infidel. He spat with vigor when the white man passed, and at other times shouted various abusive or rebelled remarks, whilst urging his brethren to down the unbeliever in the test of strength and cunning, for the glory of Allah, the one and only God. His days were most humiliating, mapped out for him by the Nubian. There seemed to be no satisfying the man's craving to master the rudiments of wrestling. From 2 hours after sunrise until the first moment of the great noonday heat, they milled and boxed, with intervals of single stick and jiu-jitsu, in which they invariably forgot instructions, lost their self-control and temper, and almost broke each other's legs, arms, heads, or backs. The afternoons were passed in the heavy, unrefreshing sleep induced by great heat. From the moment the sun slipped down behind the topmost mountain peaks, throwing deep shadows across the plateau, they were at heat again until the hour of the one big meal of the day, which takes place about 2 hours after sunset. The best part of the night they passed in gambling, storytelling, singing, or tearing over the desert on horseback, Ralph Trenchard accompanying them, invariably shadowed by the Nubian. To his intense relief, Zarah left him entirely alone for the first month. Fully aware that he was surrounded by spies, he gave no sign of the rage which swept him each time he caught sight of Ellen following the Arabian, fanning her or holding an umbrella over her, on descending the steps to the river with a great earthenware vessel on her shoulder, which she would fill for the tyrant's bath and carry up the steep steps to her dwelling. Zarah had passed the month in trying to break Ellen's splendid spirit, ignoring of the strength which real love gives to those who, either through physical weakness or untoward circumstances, are at the mercy of those moral cowards who take advantage of their distress or defenselessness. Cowards who, amongst the educated and the ignorant, the clergy, the laity, in the highest profession or in trade, place themselves morally on the level of the man who kicks his dog or hits his opponent when he is down. She made no impression on the English girl. Strong in her love, certain that her prayers for help would be answered, she endured all things. She waited on the Arabian hand and foot, climbed the ladder to the golden cage, wherein Zarah lay during the siesta, with coffee, sherbet, or whatever she desired, and descended and climbed again, with ever the sweetest smile in her steady blue eyes. She brushed and combed the red curls until her hams ached, carried and fetched and read aloud, and looked after the birds, fanned the woman, fetched water from the river for a bath, watched the silken garments, and waited upon her muse without a murmur on her lips or a shadow in her eyes. She spoke to no one, but through the gossiping of the women, learned that the body of the solid negress had not been discovered, and that Zarah, owing to a certain spirit of insubordination that had lately swept through the camp, had not dared to punish the grooms of the kennels for their gross carelessness. She was continually surrounded by the women, who, ignorant of the lies told them, jeered at and laughed at her, and did everything in their power to make a task even yet more distasteful. When away from Zarah, her every movement was spied upon and reported. She slept in a hut in which tools had been stored during the alterations to the building, rough and infinitely uncomfortable, but a very haven of refuge at the end of the day when she returned to fling herself on her knees and pray for strength and patience. If only she had known it. Spies watched her at her prayers, noting the look of peace which followed quickly upon them, and the content with which she stretched herself upon the bed composed of rugs flung upon the sand, watched her asleep and at her toilet, and ran to make report on all things, especially upon the delight she seemed to take in combing a masses of beautiful hair, and in a bath in the river long before the dawn. And when a rough hand shook Helen out of her sleep and ordered her to Zarah's presence, it seemed that God had turned a deaf ear to her prayers, and that fear must, after all, dominate her splendid courage. It was long after midnight when, with a heavily beating heart, she entered the luxurious room. Two Abyssinian women, nude save for a short petticoat which stopped above the knees, stood behind the divan, upon which Zarah lay smoking a narghileh. She lay and looked at Helen without a word, hating her for the ethereal look, which heightened her beauty and had come to her in her days of toil and privation. "I am told," she said after a while in Arabic, "that the hut you sleep in is not clean, that your habits are not the cleanly habits of the Mohammedan, that your hair has not escaped contamination from the disorder in your huts. Therefore," when Helen interrupted her quickly, she looked back at the tittering black woman and laughed. "How can you say such a thing? I am perfectly clean, my clothes are in holes through being washed on the stones, my hair to her own undoing, and yet, if she had not known it, as an answer to her prayers for her help, she undid the great golden plate and shook the rippling mass out over her shoulders, holding long strings at arm's length, until even the negresses exclaimed at the glory of its sheen. My hair is combed and brushed every day and washed once a week. It is perfectly clean." Zarah laughed as she puffed at her hubble bubble, inhaling the fumes of the tobacco of Oman, which is calculated to absolutely stun the uninitiated in its gunpowder strength. "Anyway, I do not like these tales of uncleanliness to be spread amongst my women, Ellen Raynor," she said curtly at last. I therefore have decided to keep you beneath my eyes. You will sleep in my room, on a mat. You will bathe under the supervision of the slave here, who will now cut your hair off so that you are clean. I will kill her if she touches me, Ellen cried sharply, and gathering the glory of her hair round about her, ran to a table upon which lay an ornamented but most workmanlike dagger. She loved her glorious, naturally curling hair, looking upon it with a beautiful teeth, as the greatest asset with which nature had endowed her. Her lover loved it, and had often told her that she had ensnared his heart in its golden mesh. Forgetting her impossible position as prisoner and the utter futility of any effort at resistance, determined to fight for the glorious mantle which covered her to her knees, she picked up the dagger as the two gigantic women approached her. I will kill the first one of you who touches me. Zarah laughed and raised her hand. Go and find Al-Hassad and bid him bind the white man and bring him here. Stop! Olin had thrown out her hands in surrender. Even her head would she willingly sacrifice in her great love, everything she would sacrifice except her honor, and that she knew was safe in a place abounding with deep precipices and paths where the foothold was precarious. Save for her tightly locked hands, she made no sign when the beautiful mass lay about her feet. In fact, with an almost superhuman effort of courage, she refrained from touching her shorn head, and leant down instead and picked up a handful of hair, which looked like a great skein of golden silk. It's a pity to waste it, Zarah, she said gently. Why not stuff a pillow with it? The Arabian beat hard on the amber mouthpiece of the narghileh. With her short hair curling around her face, Ellen looked like an exquisite girl of 15, defenseless, helpless, and calculated to inspire pity in the heart of almost any man. Call Namla! She lashed the Abyssinian across the thigh when she had to repeat the order. Heart that of bereft of the use of thy limbs, thou fool! She screamed, seizing the dagger from her belt and throwing it after the rapidly retreating negress, missing her shoulder by an inch as she emulated the speed of the ostrich down the doorway. Namler, upon whom Ellen had counted in her heart of hearts, had failed her, and without her help, nothing could be done, no communication with Ralph effected, no plans for escape made. Of all the crowd of women who jeered and laughed at her, she seemed to be the one who cherished the greatest hatred for her. She spat with vigor when the white girl passed, and at other times shouted various abusive and ribald remarks, urging the woman to see that the unbeliever performed a menial task thoroughly, so as to enhance the glory of Allah, the one and only God. She ran in and prostrated herself before her dread mistress, then pulled the masses of hair roughly from under Ellen's feet, and tossed it this way and that, as though it were the hair of goat or camel. A kerchief for thy head, O great mistress, could I weave, or a plaited girdle set with pearls, though 'twere well nigh sacrilege for the middle of the believer to be bound by the hair of the infidel. Behold, the infidel looks even like the skull of one dead, with a face like unbaked bread, and a head like unto the wing of the ostrich plucked of its feathers. With instructions to make what she could of the silky burden which filled both her arms, she spat, or, rather for fear of her mistress's humor, made the sound of vigorous spitting in Ellen's direction, and vanished through the doorway. Ellen lay on the floor that night, a beautiful shorn head resting on her arm, and poured out her heart in gratitude that Zarah had not seen fit to shave it completely. What is in the cauldron is taken out with the kitchen spoon, Arabic proverb. 1,000 raps at the door, but no salute or invitation from within, Arabic proverb. During the night, in the passing of a second, for no apparent reason and with all Arabs' lamentable instability, Zarah grew suddenly tired of baiting a prisoner, and with the extraordinary density of the woman in love, decided to make one last endeavor to break down Ralph's trenchard resistance. She could not understand, and she would never be able to get it into a mind narrowed by self-love, that one might as well try to stem the Niagara Falls with straw or hold a musked elephant on a daisy chain as to influence the invisible love of soulmate. She decided she would offer Ralph Trenchard Ellen's liberty. She would offer to give up a mountain home, a freedom, a power. She would offer herself as a servant, a slave, to cook for him, to wait upon him, anything to keep him by her side, no matter if he returned her love or not, as long as he lived near her. And if that failed, as a last resource would use the despicable lever of the lowest type of coward. To gain her hand, she would threaten to commit suicide. So the night following the cutting of Helen's hair, which was also the night preceding a tournament, in which the men were to show how much they had learned of the art of pugilism, she attired herself in great splendor and summoned Ralph Trenchard to her presence. Helen, surrounded by women who gossiped, knelt at the river edge, rubbing silken garment on a stone, with Namler mocking and jeering beside her when the Abyssinian, sent to fetch Ralph Trenchard, shouted her errand as she passed. Helen shrank back when Namler suddenly sprang at her and wrenched the silken garment from her hand. "Thou fool!" Namler shrilled as she knelt. "This wise, and this and this, the soap? Or hast thou eaten it in thy imbecility?" She leant across Ellen and snatched at the soap, which slid into the water, then wrung the garment as though it were the neck of an offending hen, as she whispered, "Give me a massage for the white man. Zarah offers him thy freedom for his love." Down came the garment on the stone, as though she essayed to soften the tough carcass of some female Methuselah of the poultry world as she screamed at the top of her voice. "Wilt thou never learn? Did Allah in his wisdom not teach thee even how to wash a garment? Take it and try, lest I smite thee with it." She flung the silken remnant at Helen, who, eyes alight, caught it in both ends and crashed it on the rocks until one half followed the soap into the water. Whereupon Namler leant across her and gripped her wrist. "Fool! This wise, and this and this." The women crowded round to watch Namler swinging Ellen's arms like flails. "Tell him," whispered Ellen as she beat her best, "that, nay, Namler, thou tearest out my arms. Behold, I can do no more." She fell forward with a woman underneath, and in confusion whispered a message. "Tell him I prefer that to my freedom at such a price," and shrank back, for the benefit of the onlookers, when Namler, flinging all that was left of the washing item in her face, ran off, with much cursing, up to the path to where Yusuf waited in the shadows. And hope sprang up in Ralph Trenchard's heart as he climbed the steps in answer to Sarah's summons, followed by the Nubian at some distance. Suddenly, and with a most amazing clumsiness, Yusuf walked out from behind the great boulder straight into his arms. "Sorry," said Trenchard shortly, as he tried to free himself from the grasp of the infuriated Arab. "You came out so—" "As no thought for others," shouted Yusuf at the top of his voice. "Thine ear," he whispered, whilst he shook Ralph Trenchard violently. "Zarah will offer thee thy white woman's freedom for thy love. The white woman prefers death to freedom without thee. She loves thee. Nay," he suddenly yelled, "wouldn't push a blind man to his death." The two seemed locked in anger as Al-Assad raced up the path. "A message," he whispered. "Shake me in anger. Give me a message for thy woman. Give me a message." The Nubian was close upon them. Trenchard grasped the blind man and shook him. "Tell her to stand fast and to fear nothing," he whispered, then shouted angrily, "How can I hear thy noiseless feet on thee?" He reeled as Yusuf hauled him backwards and continued to climb the steps, whilst the blind man filled the night air with curses. Zarah was quite alone. The Nubian, under others, sat down upon the steps to await development. He was well content to wait. He had gauged the white man's strength of resistance and had no fear that he would become entangled in the beautiful Arabian's wiles. He smiled as he crept as noiselessly as a great cat to the platform before the door and stretched himself flat upon it, the blackest spot in the black shadows, to listen to the woman he loved pleading for the love of one who loved another. Lost to all sense of shame, as are those women who have not learned the meaning of self-control and self-sacrifice, Zarah pleaded with Ralph Trenchard for his continued presence by her side, pleaded for his company and his comradeship, so that she might enjoy the shadow of his great good looks and actual presence, while skipping the substance of his love from a rival. She had made the greatest mistake in her toilet. None too overdressed at the best of times, she had a startlingly undressed appearance, as she stood like a beautiful exotic flower beside the Englishman. She had not, how could she in the name of decency, discarded a single garment, but had donned the most transparent outfit in her wardrobe. Her feet were bare and jeweled, as were her arms, her hands, her waist. The trousers, worn by most Arabian women, were voluminous in their transparent folds. Her body shone through a jeweled vest, which fitted her like a skin. Trenchard looked at her from head to foot, and with the perceptiveness of the human mind, immediately thought of the picture Ellen had made as she stood beside her grandfather in the desperate battle. And he backed a pace before the Arabian semi-nudity, whilst the Nubian buried his face in his arm to stifle his cry of longing. "I love thee," Zarah was saying softly, looking up at the man she loved with love-filled eyes. "I love thee, Ralph Trenchard. I have loved thee ever since I lay against thy heart so many, many moons ago. I will give up my home, my people. I will name Al-Assad as ruler in my stead. I will follow thee upon the path of thy choice, to the country that should please thee. I will wait upon thee, serve thee, devote myself to thee, if thou would give up the other woman. I love thee." "I have already told you, Zarah, that I do not love you, could never love you." Ralph Trenchard, loathing the scene, spoke curtly, and stepped back quickly as Zarah flung herself at his feet. "Do get up," he added in English, as he tried to loosen a grasp upon his knees. "If only you knew how we English loathe scenes like this, and what we think of hysterical, unbalanced people." She sat back on her heels, lifting her hands in supplication. "I offer you Ellen Raynor's freedom if you will stay with me. I do not want to keep her. Let her go back to her own country. She is young. She will forget. She does not know what love is. Besides, I fear my slave. He is handsome. He, too, is young. He wishes to take a wife. I will send Alina safely away from him if you will stay with me." Trenchard showed no sign of the horror of the fate in store for Ellen. He spoke quite calmly, slowly, almost indifferently. "You will not gain anything if you hurt Ellen. If she dies, I die. If you try to harm her, she will find a means of killing herself, and I shall kill myself. Not because of my love for her. Our kind of love is higher than suicide. It endures, but only so that you shall find no pleasure in her death." He pulled her hands up her and stepped back as she sprang to her feet. She failed to understand that, living or dead, she was no more to the man than one of the birds in his cage, and played what she mistakenly believed to be a trump card. "Then I will kill myself, Ralph Trenchard." She choked with rage, the R's in the English words rolling like little drums. "And you will never forget that upon your head will lie the death of a woman, never be able to wipe out the picture of my broken body, lying amongst the rocks." She ran close up to him, shaking with the unseemly rage of the uncontrolled woman. I go to my death. She pointed through the doorway, striking a most dramatic attitude, whilst watching for a sign of interest in her proceedings in the man's indifferent face. To my death, she screamed as she saw none, and fled through the doorway, missing the astounded Nubian by an inch. She stopped upon the edge of the very steep incline, and listened for the sound of footsteps hastening to her rescue. At the absence of all sound, she looked over her shoulder to see Ralph Trenchard, with his back to her, lighting a cigarette. She tore back into the room with the last shred of her restraint gone, and swung him round the arm. "Oh, you didn't do it?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "We have women like you in England, never very young or very pretty, who, verging upon the sere and yellow, and with nothing to fill their days or occupy their minds, try to coerce the people they love by threat of suicide. They never get what they want either. The slightest chain frets love, real love, you know. You can't inspire love just because you keep the person you love, but who doesn't love you, in the same house with you. You can't hold love by cooking or serving. Love, real love, will thrive on a crust offered by the one loved, but will seeking at the sight of a basket of sweetmeats offered by anyone else." He had no intention of giving her the slightest cause to hope by offering her any sympathy in her tantrums. He added coldly, cruelly, as he turned from her, "It's rather a pity the silly, hysterical women don't carry out their threat of suicide. The world would be no loser by their death." He backed before her as she burst into a torrent of reproach, which ended in a storm of abuse. "Go!" she screamed at the highest pitch of the Arabian voice, which is none too sweet in wrath. "Tomorrow at the tournament, I will decide what is best to be done with this white woman, who is not fit to mingle with my women and children. Yea, even owing to her dislike of water, have we cut her hair so that—" She screamed and struck at Ralph Trenchard as he caught her by the wrist and pulled her roughly to him. "What did you say? You've cut off Ellen's hair? All that wonderful golden mass. You have dared to do that. Speak, can't you?" He flung her on the divan as she laughed and clapped her hands at the sight of his horror-stricken face, and laughed again at the plan for revenge which flashed into her mind. "So I have prevailed in making you feel, Ralph Trenchard," she shouted after him as he left the room and ran down the steps, followed by the amazed Nubian. She ran to the door and laughed until the mountains echoed and re-echoed to the sound, then turned and flung herself on the floor, where she gave way to the violent hysterics of the uncontrolled jealous women. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Chapter 20. Tyrannical cheating of ill omen. Arabic proverb. The overpowering heat of the day had given place to the lesser heat of early evening as the sun sank behind the western edge of the mountain ring. The interior of the ring looked like the inside of some rough-edged, painted flower pot with great purple, blue, black foundation, and sides of green and richest reds and browns, melting to saffron, topaz, amethyst, and rose, crowned by great peaks which seemed to flicker in the terrific heat, radiated by the sun-scorched rock. Little golden pink and crimson clouds, faintly stirred by the blessed evening breeze, sailed serenely across a sky of deepest blue, which stretched a gorgeous canopy above the heads of the men seated on the ground, or up the gentle incline rising from the plateau. Those opposite the steps down which Zarah would have to pass sat with knees to chin, placidly chewing khat or smoking red or black sebel and longer pipes with big open bowl. Those to the north and south of the steps sat sideways, also contentedly chewing or smoking, with eyes fixed upon the steep path. There was no laughing, no gambling, no betting upon the outcome of the different sporting items in the tournament for which they had foregathered. They were strangely quiet, with a certain expectancy in their eyes, and a vast amount of meaning in their expressive gestures, as they commented upon and argued about tales the Nubians had spread about their mistress's strange behavior of the night before. Bismillah, upon the very edge, with one eye upon the running water, into which the lion thought she desired to throw herself, and one eye upon the white man, who by the wool is a man of strong heart, even if he be an infidel. Bowlegs laughed as he stretched his circular limbs and pressed himself against his neighbor, so as to make room for Yosef, as he came towards them, led by his ears, down the path made for him through the serried ranks. "Welcome, brother, thou true believer in the shaven crown," cried the handsome youth who had been swung like a club, and who had not followed the precepts of the prophet to the extent of shaving his head. "Hast heard that the white woman, who holdeth the heart of the man who loveth her, and who is loved of the beautiful Zarah, and may Allah guide their footsteps in the crookedness of their paths." As he spoke, he pushed his way between Bowlegs and Yusuf, and as he looked up into the mutilated face, touched the blind man gently. "Hast heard that the tiger cat, in her rage, has caused the head of a white woman to be shaven, so that if she were lost in the Roba el-Khali, the ostrich might even wish to brood upon it as her egg?" The men shouted in ribald mirth as they bandied jokes, mostly unprintable in their oriental flavor. "Yea, and shaven after the setting of the sun," said the patriarch bitterly, whilst every man in earshot touched his favorite lucky amulet, or made the finger gesture against ill luck. "Behold, will Zarah's mocking of fate surely bring catastrophe upon the camp. For what but misfortune can follow the shaving of a crown after the setting of the sun?" The fine sons of one of the most superstition-ridden races in the world performed divers tricks to placate the fury of the false god of ill luck they had raised up in their minds, then continued in their merriment. "Who has seen the shaven head?" "No eyes have seen the head, O brother, but mine own eyes have seen Namla the busy, seated like a bee in the heart of a golden flower, weaving a kerchief from the infidel's wondrous hair." Bowlegs shouted with laughter. "Yea, verily, a kerchief to replace the gentle Zarah's garments, torn asunder, twixt her teeth and fingers in her wrath at the white man's coldness. Or to wipe the tiger's cat's face, which, wet with tears and hot with anger, was like an overripe fruit of the dome tree fallen upon the sand. Or to remove the dust from her chamber, wrecked like unto a house swept by the hurricane, with feathers of many fowl, liberated from the burst cushions, clinging to the silken curtains and her hair." Prodded by fate, the handsome youth turned and laid his hand on Yusuf's arm, whilst the men crowded closer yet to listen to their conversation. "O brother," he said laughingly, "thou who hast suffered, thou who even now dost pass sleepless nights of pain, wilt thou not in thy goodness, to quieten the agony of the tiger cat's gentle heart, give unto her a few drops of the sweet water prescribed thee by yon herbalist for sleep?" Yusuf smiled as best he could for the distortion of his mouth, as he searched his cummerbund and pulled out a flask filled with the strong narcotic he took to still the throbbing of his torn nerves when the wind blew from the north. "'Tis overpowerful, little brother. A drop too little, and she wakes from her sleep, like a tigress bereft of her cubs. A drop too much, and she wakes not at all. 20 drops and what?" The voice from behind was stilled suddenly as the men rose quickly and stood staring up to the platform outside Zarah's dwelling. Zarah stood looking down. She stood almost upon the spot from where some years ago she had hurled her spear at the fighting dogs, and, killing the one intended for a gift to her father's guest, had followed the decree of fate, who had tangled her life's thread with those of her white prisoners. Zarah is the queen of loveliness, with hair like the setting sun. The hawk-eyed men, with a superb sight of those who live in the clear atmosphere of great spaces, criticized in detail the Arabian's garments, which at such a distance would have shown as a white blur to the eyes of the Westerner, accustomed as he is to an horizon bounded by walls, and a sky ever limited by chimney-pots or partially obliterated by smoke or fog. The white man tarries. Would that the lion were here to tell once again of the calmness of his fate in the storm of yesternight. Perchance does his heart fail at the thought of the maiden's shaven crown. Likewise does she tarry, fearful perchance of beholding her lover's eyes empty of love light. She gave her the vinegar to drink on the wings of flies. Yusuf touched his sad face as he quoted the proverb. Verily were the words of wisdom written to describe the refinement of the tortures our thrice gentle mistress meteth out to her prisoners. There was not a movement, not a whisper from the men when Zarah turned and lifted her hand, but there came a great cry from hundreds of throats as Helen appeared in the doorway, followed by the two gigantic Abyssinian women. Hast seen the shaven crown, brother? The handsome youth turned to Yusuf, who stood with his sightless face raised to the skies. Nay, blind one, he replied quietly, all the merriment gone from his face. I have seen the white woman. She stands behind the dread Zarah, her golden hair, even the length of thy longest finger, twining about her head like a crown of flowers upon a young acacia tree. She is like an orchid of choice fruit in her beauty, yea, like an orchid of pomegranates and peaches. And as the gentle incline of the rocks where the evening sun kisseth the oranges and apricots and luscious fig. If it were not that she is of a race of infidels, likewise cursed with a spirit of mockery and a lack of gratitude, I would e'en woo her in the shadows of the night and make of her my woman. He moved forward, drawn by Helen's radiant beauty, as she descended the steps, fanning Zarah with a circular painted fan of dried palm leaves. The men stood as though spellbound at the sight of the two beautiful girls. They forgot the tournament, their wrath, their merriment. They stood speechless, staring. They moved forward in a body. As Zarah reached the bottom step and made a way for her, up to where an ebony chair inlaid with gold stood upon a carpet of many colors. The expression of Zarah's sullen face was almost as black as the shadows spreading halfway up the mountains. Her heavy brows were bent above her strange eyes, her crimson mouth set in a line which boded no good to those who might thwart her. A chance word, an indiscreet gesture, would be spark enough to start the conflagration, and fate, close to the Helen Raynor, stood ready to fire the Arabian's raging jealousy as Ralph Trenchard, followed by the Nubian, walked slowly from the men's quarters towards them. There was not a sound, and scarcely a movement in the vast throng of men as they stood looking from one to the other of the three who, even in the desert, made the seemingly inevitable love triangle. And so enthralled were they, and so oblivious were the three who composed the triangle to their surroundings, that no notice was taken of the downtrodden, docile women who, headed by Namla, and imbued with the spirit of insubordination which was sweeping the camp, also with a fierce desire to see the white woman's shaven head, crept in ones and twos from behind the rock buttress which hid their quarters from the greater part of the plateau. They stole along the river edge behind their men, who were too engrossed in the picture before them even to bet, let alone to notice the doings of their womenkind. They crept up behind the gigantic Abyssinian women who stood behind Zarah's chair, and turned and looked at them as a couple of Yemen buffaloes might turn to inspect an ant-heap. The radiance of the blazing sky seemed to fill the mountain ring for a moment as Ralph Trenchard passed down the path made for him by the men, and stood suddenly clear of them and exactly opposite Helen as she fanned the Arabian. The mountains echoed Helen's name as he called to her, holding out his arms, and her cry of joy as she flung the circular fan with pointed edges sideways, so that by mischance it caught the Arabian's hair and ran to her lover. The rocks echoed Zarah's screams of wrath and pain as her sharp order to the Abyssinians, and the downtrodden women's screams of hate as they swept round the chair headed by Namla and cut Helen off. Zarah shrieked in agony as the fan pulled her head down to one side, scratching her face and shoulder, and beat the arms of the chair and the Abyssinians' glistening bodies as they tried their best to relieve her, while she fought like a wild cat, with her eyes fixed on the fight which was taking place in front of her. The women were trying to prevent Helen from reaching her lover, and the men were endeavoring, and none too gently, to push the women on one side, so that the white man they had come to admire and like might meet the woman of his heart. They did it for the sport of the thing, and to assert their authority over their women. Also, in their heart of hearts was there a certain amount of admiration for Helen's beauty and courage. The women who had come to titter and jeer at Helen's bald head were consumed with wrath at their disappointment, and fought their men tooth and nail, taking advantage of the scrum to pay off many an old score and avenge many a lash of the whip or tongue. The men, amused at first, then astounded, then really angry at the sudden exhibition of women's rights, slapped their own particular womenfolk with the flat of their hand, then smote them smartly with the mijan, and finally took them violently until their sleek heads seemed like to leave their shoulders and their beautiful teeth to break in their chattering. Ralph Trenchard stood at the back of the men who slapped and shook and cursed. Helen stood looking towards him, towering above the dusky little women like a young acacia tree in the bush. In spite of the peril in which they knew themselves to stand, they smiled across and called messages to each other, which were lost in the universal torrents of abuse and vociferous yelling, interspersed with screams and sounds of slapping and tearing. Namla, wedged on the outer circle of the maelstrom, fought like a fury to get at Helen, screaming abuse, hurling her fighting sisters from her path in the excess of her screaming rage, while Yusuf, led by his eyes, rattled his staff on the shins of the gentler sex as he strove to reach Namla. Bowlegs brought about their meeting. Aided by the mighty muscle of his legs, he leapt free of the shrieking sisterhood high into the air, and in a manner somewhat reminiscent of a hawk and a field mouse, pounced upon his second and obese wife, whom he had spied fighting with the best in much torn raiment. The tremendous impact from above flung her backwards against Namla, who in turn was flung backwards against Yusuf. Proceeded a pretty passage of arms and tongues between these two, during which the blind man slipped a silver bottle down the front of Namla's torn kameez, while she belabored him, and Yusuf's eyes rained blows upon his mother's back. "Aye, aye, aye," she wailed, as she rolled the flask in the top part of her torn petticoat. "Wouldst tear the very tenura from my limbs, thou wifeless, childless breaker of the prophet's law? Push me forward. Ha! That's what pushed me forward, thou rascal son of mine, even unto the first line of my fighting sisters. Well, push hard, so that I leave the mark of my nails upon the white girl's face." Helen turned at the sound of the woman's voice, and raised herself on tiptoe the better to see, and caught the look of the dusky little woman's twinkling eye, which in no wise responded to the wrath of her voice and gestures. "Yea, white woman," she shrieked, "come nearer to me, or let me come nearer unto thee. If thou art not afraid, I will show thee what manner of a woman it is thou didst mimic and mock." "Afraid!" cried Helen, forcing a way through the men. "Afraid! Come to me and—" She reeled back as Namla flung herself upon her, pushed by her son, who pulled the blind man after him, whilst the men who were not actually engaged in taming their shrews surged round them, shouting in delight. Namla landed right on Helen's chest, to which she clung as a woodpecker to a tree trunk. "Take this! 10 drops this night before she sleeps, then wait in the shadows," she whispered, loudly, with great excitement. "Take this, 10 drops this night before she sleeps, then wait in the shadows," she whispered, then shrieked, "Ha, thou infidel! I would tear out thine eyes, Yusuf's eyes suddenly and forcibly pinched the underpart of his mother's arm, upon which she yelled, let go her hold on Helen, and leapt at him, then slid meekly to earth and tried to cover her face with her torn veil, which she spread out to arm's length as Helen hid the silver flask in her belt. The sun had set, leaving the sky in a tumult of violent coloring, through which in a small patch of deepest blue shone one great star. Helen looked upon the banners of gold and red and orange, the curtains of saffron, the trails of rose and wispy bands of gray, then looked across at Zarah, who walked slowly towards her, blood trickling down her scratched cheek. Her eyes flamed in her white face, which showed over the top of the dead black satin cloak she had wrapped round her like a skin, and Ralph Trenchard, who saw the menace in her somber eyes and the cruel twist to her mouth, seized the men nearest him and threw them on one side as he raced to get to Helen before the Arabian could reach her. He was a second too late. Even as he touched her, one of the gigantic Abyssinian women reached her and, lifting her like a straw, carried her to where Zarah stood, insolently, contemptuously watching the scene, whilst Yusuf stepped in front of him and pushed him back as his eyes got tangled up in his feet. "For God's sake, get out of my way, you fool!" Trenchard shouted, and lifted the dumb youth by the neck of his juba and dropped him, and Yusuf rushed blindly at him, guided by his voice. "Tonight, when the dog barks thrice," he whispered, then shouted, "Harm not mine eyes, lest I stray from the right path, so that—" He stopped and turned, as Helen's voice came clearly through the night air. "Don't worry about me, Ra. I'm all right. No one can harm me," she cried, then stepped back quickly as Zarah turned on her and seized her by the wrist, pulled her forward. Held by Yusuf, who whispered without ceasing, Trenchard stood in the center of a semicircle of men and women, with the patriarch at the end nearest Zarah and Helen, and Namla in a most indecorous and disheveled state at the other. The two beautiful girls stood exactly opposite the man they loved, with the gigantic negress close behind. "Move not. Have patience until the dog barks thrice tonight. Make no effort to help. All is well. Allah watches over thee and thine in need. Nay, make no sign. Nothing can be done to her until the morrow." Yusuf whispered without ceasing, whilst, sick to the heart at the menace in the air, Ralph Trenchard stood waiting, with what patience he could command. Zarah raised her hand, and, fully aware of the backing she would get from the women, began to speak. "I am speaking for my children," she cried. "The children this white woman has mocked and derided, and for whom she has not had one word of thanks, not one little feeling of gratitude." "Nam, Nam," wailed Namla, in full acquiescence. "For myself, I do not mind that she strikes me until the blood runs, but my children I will protect." "Ah!" wailed Namla, crouching on the ground and beating her breast with much vigor. "And I will punish those who hurt my children. Yea, I will make of them a sport, a mock. The white man, nay, Al-Assad, came thou to me. The white man I bear no ill will, for he has worked well among my sons." She put her hand upon the Nubian's arm when he ran across to her, and smiled up into his handsome face as she shook her head. "I am mistress here. Thou shalt not touch the white man. For the white woman—" She looked at Helen, who looked at her, then across to Ralph Trenchard, who stood with Yusuf's hand upon his arm and his eyes at his feet. "For the white woman who has derided my children, I do now place her amongst them as their servant, and to humiliate her even as she has humiliated them. Do order the Abyssinian Aswa to shave her head this instant, before us all, so that she appears not before mankind without—" Her words were drowned in the scream which burst uncontrollably from Helen, and the shout from her lover as he flung himself toward her, only to be tripped by the dumb youth at his feet. "Ra! Ra!" cried Helen, clutching her lovely curls in both hands. "For God's sake, save me, Ra! Don't let them do it! Don't! She turned and struck the negress across the face, as the Abyssinian caught her by the arm, and struck again and again as Ralph Trenchard tore at the arms of the youth who clung to him, like a leech. Helen made no other sound as she wrenched herself free from the woman who held her, nor when, filled with the desire to kill, she flung herself upon Zarah. The Arabian stepped back quickly and laughed until the place rang with the sound, then flung off her mantle and drove her dagger down into Helen's heart, just as the patriarch sprang and caught her hand. Helen turned and ran towards her lover, and struck at Namla, who suddenly caught her by the knees and held her, screaming abuse. The men and women stood silent, looking from one to the other of the three principals in the love drama, then turned their attention to the patriarch, who by that time was speaking. He made a magnificent picture as he imposed his will upon the furious woman for the welfare of his brethren. "In the days of thy father, the sheik, my daughter," he said, "no blood was spilled, no punishment proclaimed after the setting of the sun. If thou desirest the death of this woman, then must thou wait until sunrise. Neither shalt thou bring misfortune upon this camp by shaving a head after the setting of the sun. That also must thou order to be done after its rising. Wah, wah, yelled the men, and smote the women who dared to differ. And for fear of the wrath of these women, who should have the whip laid across them for their unseemly behavior? Keep thou the white woman in thy chamber tonight. Yea, cried Joseph, walking forward, led by his eyes, until he stood exactly opposite the Arabian, who withdrew a pace before his terrible appearance. And in the name of thy father, O Zarah, and for fear of the Nubian's wrath being vented upon him before the rising of the sun, I claim the watching of the white woman this night. Fear not that he sleeps over sweetly in my care. He turned and spat in Ralph Trenchard's direction, then, led by his eyes, strode towards him and seized him by the arm. Thou infidel, he cried savagely, thou and thy white woman. Zarah raised her hand. The women to the cooking, the men to the eating, the morrow for the punishment. She turned and looked at Ralph Trenchard, her eyes filled with a terrible jealousy. Look upon thy white woman for the last time, for behold, the morrow thou shalt be taken back across the desert by the road by which thou didst come unto her. She shall work here amongst my people, with her shaven head for a space. Then I will send her to the slave market, where her white skin will fetch a great price. Get thou up, Helen Renaud. She pointed up the steps. Helen turned and held out her arms. Ra, beloved, I love you. The Arabian struck down her arms, as Yusuf pulled Ralph Trenchard back. Come thou with me, thou infidel, he cried. Get thou up, Helen Renaud, commanded the Arabian. The stars blazed in the sky as the women scuttled back to their quarters, and the men talked together. Behold, is my acacia tree no luck? Said the handsome youth. As saith the proverb of those whose luck changeth not, replied Bowlegs, as he shook his fist after his retreating, obeisant second wife. The misfortune either falls upon the camel, or upon the camel driver, or upon the owner of the camel. Ha! Wouldst show me what thou hast learned from the white man? He caught the Arab who had sprung at him in a friendly desire to show his pugilistic skill, tossed him on one side like a bundle of clothes, and shouted defiance to the whole camp. So that the tournament, if somewhat impromptu and lacking a referee, took place after all, and lasted well into the night. End of chapter 20. Jesus.
Chapter 21 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Florence Short. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Chapter 21. At the close of night the cries are heard. Arabic proverb. Yusuf, with his back against the door of Ralph Trenchard's hut, lifted his face to the star-bestrewn sky. He waited. He waited for the striking of his hour of revenge, which had been fixed by fate in the beginning of time. He waited imperturbably for Allah, in his compassion and wisdom, to remove the Nubian who sat cross-legged and contemplative, and to all appearances absolutely unmovable, by his side. Al-Assad sat leaning slightly forward, looking into the shadows with dreamy, half-shut eyes, then turned his head and listened, as though, above the distant noise of the men's shouting and laughter, some sound had reached his ears. Camels, he said softly, camels going out. Methought our brothers were having their fill of wrestling. Yusuf also had heard the sound of a dromedary grunting its disapproval as it made the steep ascent, but no sign of his inner perturbation showed on his placid, mutilated face. Zarah the Merciless makes ready for the white man's journey into the desert tomorrow. Our brethren of the stables even now revile her shadow, for instead of loading the dromedaries with water-skins and provender, they would try their strength against Bowlegs, who, in his vanity, swears by the wind that no man can excel him in the games taught by the white man. Al-Assad laughed scornfully as he rose to his feet, swallowing the bait which hung from the line fate dangled in front of him for his removal. Bowlegs, he spoke in infinite scorn as he pulled himself up to his full height, and laughed again as he caused the muscle to ripple up and down his arms. 'Twere well to show the little man with legs even as round as thy turban, that there is one who can spike him upon his finger. Thinkest thou, Yusuf, that the white maid will lose her golden covering at the rising of the sun? 'Twere a pity, to my mind, to mutilate such beauty in a woman, even if she be sent to the slave market to ease the tiger cat's jealousy. Yusuf pulled at his hubble-bubble, making no sign of his longing to accelerate his companion's departure. Methinks the beautiful Zarah spoke in haste and in anger. Perchance she is tired of her white playthings and yearns for a master. Thinkest thou, who hast learned much wisdom in thy blindness, that she will come to love me? Al-Assad asked eagerly. Yea, she loves thee even now. Thou art her real mate. The great tiger cats mate with one another, my son, and were it not wise to stay here for fear that thou art bested by Bowlegs, and that the news of thy defeat is carried to her? He showed no sign of his intense satisfaction when the Nubian, primed with the desire to reduce Bowlegs to shreds, ran, laughing, down the path. Strong in the fatalism of the East, Yusuf sat on, pulling calmly at his hubble-bubble, waiting for the striking of his hour, and made no answer to a slight hissing sound which came from behind the rocks. Instead, he rose slowly and pushed open the door of the hut, and, with the Oriental's love of elaborate detail where intrigue is concerned, shouted at Ralph Trenchard. Thou infidel, thou white dog, sleepest thou? Hast thou no bowels of compassion for the white woman? Dost thou leave her here to work as a slave without an ache in thy heart of stone? Ralph Trenchard sprang up and crossed the hut quickly at the blind man's beckoning finger. Mine eyes waits without to lead you by the hidden path to where the dromedaries stand, Yusuf whispered. Nay, speak not, tarry not. There is little time to spare. The dromedaries must be but specks upon the horizon when the men cease their games to seek their slumber. Trenchard wrapped himself in the burnous Yusuf offered him and followed him to the door, where they stood for a moment in the shadows, listening to the shouts of the men, which came startlingly clear on the night air. Bowlegs fights with the lion, whispered Yusuf. Now is the moment chosen by Allah for the escape. Mine eyes will lead you to the dromedaries, and I will go to fetch her excellency, to carry her over the dangerous places and down the steep path to where love and happiness will await her. But if the Arabian does not sleep, how then? Then you must go to her and break her neck to save your own woman. What is she, this daughter of two races? We tire of her. If she dies, he who will govern in her stead will be chosen by the casting of lots. Hasten, excellency, for we know not at what hour the medicine of sleep was administered unto the tiger cat. Also, do the women who hate the white woman, and who are the yeast wherewith this trouble has been fermented, rise early to be about the business of the new day? Trenchard, wrapped in their burnous, followed Yusuf as he made his way without hesitation to the spot where his eyes sat in the shadows. Yusuf whispered the dumb youth's name and questioned him, and nodded his head in satisfaction when the youth, in the code they had invented, tapped the answers to the questions upon his friend's arm. "All is ready, Excellency." Yusuf spoke as calmly as if he discussed a pleasure trip to the nearest oasis. "Namla waits at the edge of the sands of death. The camels are well laden with water and bread for many days. They are the swiftest in Arabia, renowned from Hadramota to Oman. Bread in Oman. They will need no drink for 10 days if there is none to spare. Namla accompanies you, and you, Yusuf, you're coming with us. We can't leave you behind to face the racket. You have got to come. Your eyes can't let his mother go without him." Yusuf smiled and shook his head and laid his hand upon the dumb youth's shoulder, who also smiled and shook his head. "Excellency, not for 10,000 golden lira would I be away from the camp when the tiger cat learns of the flight. A piece of news for you, white man, who comprehends not the guile of this woman of mixed blood. Did you think she had tired of you? Nay, by the beard, she loves you even 100 times more for your refusal of her love. She sends you to Harik after the rising of the sun, only to follow you and to beguile you in the solitude of the red desert. There is no leech that clings so close to its victim as a woman to the one she loves, but who does not return that love. There is no trick she will not descend to, no lie she will not utter, no promise she will not make with no intent to keep, to gain her end. This is the commencement of my revenge. The end, Excellency, will be the death of her who blinded me. I have waited for this revenge these many years. Even from the moment when the sun faded from my sight, I and mine eyes will follow you. And if we do not overtake you by the noon, then place yourself in Namla's keeping. She is of the desert born." He raised his right hand and turned his sightless face to the skies. "May Allah guide you and keep you, and bring you to everlasting peace." Trenchard stood for a moment to watch the blind man make his almost miraculous way through the rocks which skirted the west end of the plateau, then turned and followed the dumb youth, who smiled and nodded his head in his delight at the trick which was being played upon the Arabian. And Namla rose from where she sat in the shadows thrown by the 3 dromedaries, hobbled at the commencement of the hidden path across the quicksands, and pressed her hand against her forehead in humble salutation, and smiled up at her son, and laughed softly in the delight she also felt at the way the beautiful Zarah was being duped. Within the hour she might have to give her life in her fight for the liberty she had lost some years back when captured in the desert, or she might lose it in saving that of the white woman she had grown to love. But with all the Oriental's fatalism, she had resigned herself to liberty or to recapture, to life or death. Allah had decided the result in the womb of time. Kismet. Yusuf's eyes pressed the back of his hand against his forehead, then bent and touched Ralph Trenchard's foot as a sign that he was willing to serve the white man to the end, whilst Namla, smiling all over her homely face, translated the gestures the dumb boy made as he tried to make Trenchard understand. "He says, Excellency, that before the sun is above our heads at noon, he will have guided the blind one to you upon the path we shall have made across the desert. He loves you for your gentleness and strength, O man of the great white race, and prays you to succor Yusuf if aught should befall him before he reaches the great city of Damascus, which is his home and my home." Trenchard raised his right hand and made his oath after the manner of the Arabs. "Before my God, who is thy God, I swear to make myself responsible for the comfort, welfare, and happiness of the 3 who have so befriended me and mine. I swear that my descendants unto the father's generation shall befriend thy descendants, so that in some small way I shall pay my debt of gratitude." He smiled down at the enraptured little woman. Let us sit a whilst we wait. Come, Namla, tell me of the life thou wilt lead in Damascus with thy people. The stillness of the night was broken by the grumbling of the dromedaries, the distant shouts of the men, and the body woman's whispered words as she told him of the house she would buy or rent in the bazaar, with rugs upon the floor and many brass pots and pans of her own, filled with milk and butter from her own kind. And when her Excellency returns to Arabia, then will Namla wait upon her, she said, smiling at the thought, being sure, with the fatalist's conviction, of a happy ending to the flight. Then will her golden hair once more glisten like the silk in the sun, which makes of the bazaar a paradise. She paused for a moment as she drew out a packet wrapped in a cloth. We have gifts which perchance His Excellency in His goodness will allow His humble servants to present to the sit upon her marriage, as a token of the gratitude the servants have in their hearts for the gentleness of the white people. Trenchard took the packet, removed the cloth, and looked at the exquisite golden kerchief. By Jove, what a beautiful thing! He exclaimed. Namla smiled and nodded her sleek head at his genuine admiration. It is woven of your Excellency's hair, Helen's hair. He turned to Yusuf's eyes as the youth pressed something hard and heavy into his hands, speaking by gesture, which his mother translated. His fine teeth gleamed and his beautiful eyes flashed as he watched Trenchard remove the wrapping from the heavy object. "However did you get this?" Trenchard cried, as he delightedly turned his own automatic over in his hand and released the full clip. The mistress, and may Allah guide a bullet to her black heart, commanded the patriarch, who is the oldest amongst us and possessed of a very devil of gaming, to guard the weapon of death for your departure, Excellency. The old one, bereft of his last piastre, and of the very camille from about his shrunken old body, did lose the weapon in a bet to my son when you did wrestle with and overthrow the Nubian. Trenchard tried to express his delight at the gifts, upon which, with all the Arab's genuine and world-famed hospitality, the two natives offered him all they possessed. "My son," whispered Namla, "will live with me in the bazaar, yea, and with us will sojourn Yusuf, his friend. The blind one will sit peacefully in the sun until he find a wife to take pity upon him, whilst his eyes, even my son, will sell the steel of Damascus inlaid with gold to the faithful and to the infidel. Our home will be humble, O white man, but our food and our drink, our raiment and our couch will be for you and her Excellency, if your Excellencies should see fit to honor our humble dwelling. And I—" She stopped suddenly and held up her hand as she listened to the sound of a dog barking. It barked angrily, at which sound the little woman shook her head. "Verily, 'tis a dog," she whispered. "When the blind one shall have carried her Excellency safely by the steep and dangerous path, which is midway between here and where Zarah the Merciless sleeps, then will he bark thrice, and in all the kennels there is not one who can say if it be a dog which barks or Yusuf. Methinks he is overlong upon the road." She clasped her hands together upon her faithful heart. "Has mischance befallen them? Does your Excellency think that mischance causeth him to tarry thus?" Mischance did not cause Yusuf to tarry. Seated in the shadows beneath the window through which Namla had spied upon the Arabian and Al-Assad, he waited calmly for the moment of his revenge. There was utter silence and stillness inside the building. No sound of voice or movement gave Yusuf any indication as to what had taken place in the last hour. Neither in his blindness had he any means by which to find out if the Arabian slept or if she lay awake upon the divan watching the stars through the doorway. He sat as immovable as the fate to which, as an Arab, he was resigned, and he made no movement when Zarah's mocking laugh suddenly broke the silence. Helen sat on the floor with her back against the wall, the light from the lamp shining on the golden curls which were to be shaven on the morrow. A shaven crown. The Hindu widow, the vision of bald pate seen in the mirror twixt the curtains of the hairdresser's cubicle. The aasvogel sitting disconsolately on its perch in the zoological gardens. She shivered as the pictures flashed across her mind. Zarah, lying like a tiger behind the golden bars of her elevated bed, laughed when Helen suddenly clasped her head in uncontrollable horror, twisting her fingers in her curls, and she laughed again when the white girl sprang to her feet and stood looking up with a world of rebellion in her eyes. "Do you remember my vision, Helen, dear school friend?" she said mockingly in Arabic, "when I saw you in the dust at my feet and the white man coming towards me? Verily will you be in the dust tomorrow, and so covered therewith that my children will walk upon you and cleanse their feet and sandals upon your raiment. You fool!" She slid her feet over the edge and stood upright upon the fourth step, straight, slender, and very beautiful. Then, balancing herself upon her precarious foothold with outstretched arms, descended slowly and walked to where Helen stood against the wall. She laughed as she looked at Helen's golden curls. "I hate you, Helen Raynor. I hated you the first time I saw you in Cairo, when you tried to show your superior breeding to the contemptible half-caste. I did not. You, whose grandfather was of a caste of water-carriers, whilst my father's fathers dwelt in the shadow of the great pharaohs, and my mother at the court of Spain. The white man shall see you with your shaven crown. Then, when the picture of your bald head is set for eternity in his mind, so that, waking or sleeping, he will laugh at the thought of you, I will ride out to meet him in the desert, to sit with him under the moon, to talk with him until dawn, to sing to him until his eyes close in dreams of my beauty. You fool, to pit yourself against me." Helen smiled as she looked at the Arabian from head to foot. She was sick with fear of the morrow, and sick with disappointment at the absence of all sign of help, but she smiled with the indomitable spirit of the splendid race from which she sprang. She took no notice of Zarah when she stretched herself upon a divan in a corner of the room, nor of the body women when they passed her, laughing derisively and making signs of contempt with their expressive fingers. She watched them descend the steps and involuntarily listened to the jokes they bandied amongst themselves about the ceremony of shaving, which would take place at the waking of their mistress at the rising of the sun. Then sat down with her back to the wall, hoping against hope for a sound or a sight of Namla or Yusuf. As there could be no doubt as to Zarah's intention of carrying out her threat, the situation was desperate, and the help promised seemed so vague, hanging upon the chance that the Arabian would ask for sherbet or coffee before she went to sleep. If she went to sleep, she was just as capable of staying awake the whole night, smoking her nargileh or countless cigarettes without touching food or coffee, as she was of sleeping without stirring until dawn. And if she called for coffee and drank it, drugged, and slept, what then? What could Namla, a humble slave, do, even if she connived with Yusuf to further their escape? "Bring me sherbet instantly." Yusuf made no movement as the words came to him through the window. Helen's heart beat heavily as she prayed for help in her hour of great need. "Now, God, help me, now," she whispered as she rose slowly and crossed the room to the corner where she prepared the drinks or messes of sweetmeats the Arabian consumed frequently in the night. With her back to her tormentor, she pulled the flask which contained the drug from inside her belt and unscrewed the tight-fitting top, and with steady hand dropped 10 drops into the golden goblet which Zarah loved on account of its barbaric jeweled stem. In the name of Allah, was a snail included in your parentage, or are your fingers as heavy as your wits? You will fetch but a poor price with your clumsiness and shaven crown. Hasten, or by the prophet's beard, I will lower your price still further by marking your shoulders with the whip. Helen slowly crossed the room, carrying the tray with the goblet filled to the brim with sweet, frothing drink, and offered it to the Arabian, who sat up suddenly, making a quick, savage gesture with both her hands. Do you think such arrogance suits a slave? Kneel. The prisoner's fate trembled in the balance as for one brief second Helen, consumed with a desire to fling the goblet in the beautiful mocking face, grasped its jeweled stem. Then, remembering that the victorious or disastrous ending of the attempt to escape depended entirely upon her, she knelt, and stirring the sherbet with an ivory spoon, offered the tray on uplifted hands. To keep her kneeling, Zarah drank slowly, whilst Helen half closed her eyes under the agony of her suspense. There was no sign in her face of her terror when, with but a drain to drink, Zarah sniffed at the goblet, scowled, and flung it to the farther end of the room, thereby drinking 1 drop too little of the drug. Have you not learned how to mix so simple a drink as this? She raved inelegantly, wiping her beautiful mouth with the back of her hand. Were it not that my women taste all that you touch, and replace all that you have touched every hour, and likewise that none but my women approach you or have speech with you, I would swear by the prophet that you had put something in my cup. Bring me coffee, hot and strong, in the big bowl. Hasten, lest I summon the black women to teach you the real meaning of speed. Helen's heart sank. She had no idea of the potency of the drug or the time required for it to take effect, but she knew the stimulating effect black coffee had on the Arabian, and how, once she had drunk a bowlful of it, she would pass a sleepless night, reading or smoking, or roaming about the camp, paying surprise visits to the kennels and to her people's quarters. She spent long precious minutes in fanning the brazier, which burned brightly behind a screen, casting fleeting glances towards the divan to see if the Arabian showed any sign of somnolence. Zarah sat cross-legged, looking through the doorway at the stars and showing as much sign of sleep as an angry cat. She turned and frowned at Helen when she clattered various brass pots and pans, making a great to-do, so as to waste still more precious moments over the intricate process of brewing the sickly sweet Arabian coffee. "Bring the coffee!" Zarah shouted suddenly, swinging her feet to the floor and half rising from the cushions. Helen placed the brass pot, the porcelain bowl, and a smaller bowl of scented water upon the silver tray, looked over her shoulder at the Arabian, and caught her breath. Zarah yawned widely, heavily. The whole future depended upon the next 5 minutes. Her future, the future of the man she loved. Another few moments, and Zarah the Cruel might be asleep. Yet what excuse could she make for wasting those precious moments? Everything was ready on the tray. It would take but a moment to cross the floor, and another 5, perhaps 10, for the strong, hot black coffee to be drunk and to react against the drug. And then farewell to all hope of escape. Must I come and fetch it myself? Helen moved forward, carrying the tray. Zarah glared at her and yawned until it seemed her scarlet mouth could not bear the strain. "The coffee," she said slowly, and rubbed her eyes, just as Helen, with a sharp cry, twisted her foot sideways, pretended to recover her footing, and let fall the tray and its contents with a loud clatter to the floor. Zarah sprang to her feet with a shout of rage, which ended in a yawn, staggered forward a step or two, swung sideways, and fell back across the divan, where she lay peacefully, sound asleep. Helen lay perfectly still, so as not to attract the Arabian's attention in any way. Then, assured that she slept soundly, gathered herself up and stole across to the divan. "Oh, Yusuf, if you were only here," she said as she stood looking down at the sleeping girl, wondering what step she should take next, then turned to look out at the night sky. Outlined against the sky, Yusuf stood in the doorway. She ran to him and touched his arm, whereupon he smiled as best he could for the distortion of his mouth, and put his hands to his forehead, lips, and heart. "She sleeps, Yusuf, soundly. I gave her 10 drops." Helen whispered the words, though she might have safely shouted them aloud for all the effect they would have on Zarah. "Does she lie at ease, Excellency? If not, stretch her forth as though she passed the night in natural sleep. Let nothing cause her fret, and thereby hasten her waking." Helen crossed to the divan and looked down at the merciless girl who had no pity for man or beast. She lay full length in the exquisite raiment she had worn for the tournament, her face half hidden in her arm, smiling like a child in her sleep. Helen watched her for a moment, then drew a satin coverlet over the Arabian's feet, glanced round the room, moved slowly round the walls, blowing out the lamps which hung from the silver sconces, and returned to Yusuf. "I will carry your Excellency down the steep unused path, for fear that some of those who wrestle with each other might see you. Come, I will lead you to where your lover waits, even I, blind Yusuf." Helen put her hand in his and looked back at the woman who had tried her best to humble her to the dust and failed. She touched her curls and smiled involuntarily at the thought that neither the daily round of menial tasks nor the threat of death had frightened her as had the threat to shave her head. "I shall never be able to thank you, Yusuf," she said, as he lifted her into his arms and carried her across the broad ledge upon which the Holy Fathers had built the dwelling place. "Put your arms around my neck, Excellency, for in times of stress must custom and thought of race vanish. I will hold you on my left arm. My right hand knoweth every jutting rock, my feet every stone upon this path. Shut your eyes, Excellency, for they say that one with vision would not dare to tread this road. We must hasten, for who knows if the tiger cat will not waken 'neath the urging of her hate-filled mind. Your arm about my neck, and your heart full of courage until the waning of the morning star, when you and your lover will be far upon the road to freedom and happiness." Helen did not shut her eyes, and until the end of her life she never forgot the descent. Certain of every inch of the path, rendered as sure-footed as a goat through the blindness which had uprooted the dread spectre of fear from his mind, feeling with his feet, clinging with his hand, climbing, scrambling, dropping safely upon the narrowest foothold, Yusuf carried Helen safely by the hidden and almost unnegotiable path to where the dromedaries lay in the shadows. Just once he stopped to give the pre-arranged signal. "That's it, Excellency," he said briefly, as Trenchard sprang towards him and took Helen into his arms. "Helen, my beloved, you at last." He let her slip to her feet and crushed her up against his heart, whilst the Arabs busied themselves with the camels' packs. "Dearest," whispered Helen, as she lifted her radiant face to his, "I began to think I should never see you again." "We must hasten, Excellencies. Life stretches before you full of hours of happiness. These moments are fraught with danger. Mine eyes and I will follow you or not, as wills Allah, the one and only God of mercy and compassion. I will lead her Excellency's camel across the hidden path. Mine eyes will lead yours, your Excellency. Namla desert-born, will ride her own. Wilt thou not, sister?" Namla laughed softly. She was helping her son to tighten knots and to fasten the loads upon the camels' backs still more securely. "Yea, brother, that will I. I would cross the desert on foot to escape from the claws of the tiger cat. All is ready, Excellency. A water skin each, and much bread, and many luscious dates, coffee, and the wherewithal to make many cups. A tent for the noonday heat. To the northeast, and then due north, His Excellency says. And may Allah guide our feet and thy feet, O blind brother, to liberty and peace." Trenchard and Helen made one last effort to induce Yusuf and his eyes to join them. "Now's your chance, Yusuf. It seems so much like running away to leave you to face the row by yourself. Come with us, Yusuf." Helen laid her hand on the blind man's arm as she spoke. "You and your eyes." She laid her other hand on the dumb youth's arm, standing, linked to them in a friendship that was to endure a lifetime. "Excellencies," replied Yusuf, "before Allah I would rather pass my life in prison than miss the tiger cat's rage when she finds you gone. Behold, the calmness of the white people when in the midst of danger has won our hearts and will pass as history down the generations. Not by word or sign have you showed fear or anger, thereby, with the mercy of Allah, winning your way to freedom. Nor," he added with a smile, "do the white people waste overmuch time in rejoicing or protestations of affection." "Have a little patience, Yusuf," said Helen, as she righted herself after having swayed backwards and forwards and bent this way and that in answer to the movement of the camel as it lurched to its feet with considerable lamentation and sounds of wrath. "Wait until we come out to Damascus to visit you. Then we will all rejoice together, won't we, Ra?" "Rather," said Ralph Trenchard, as he leant over and took Helen's hand and kissed it. Then let it go as Yusuf led her camel forward, having found his direction by turning his face to the night wind as he touched the spear. "Not a word, Excellencies," he said. When the 3 camels stood in a line upon the narrow path, upon each side of which lay a terrible death, the wind plays strange tricks with sound from this spot, carrying at times the spoken word from the quicksands to the rocks, which increase it 100-fold until the camp is filled with whispering. Allah grant that the dogs do not bark and waken the tiger cat until dawn, and that my brothers cease not their games until I am seated once more without the empty hut. Helen turned and smiled at her lover and leant sideways and waved her hand to the devoted body woman, who, in her placidity, looked as though she were embarking upon a picnic instead of a dash for liberty across the desert. The mountains towered behind them, grim and menacing. The desert stretched, silvery and peaceful under the stars. The quicksands lay on each side of their hidden path, still and treacherous. Yusuf walked ahead, leading Helen's camel. His eyes followed. Namla came last, looking as must have looked Ruth or Naomi or any other woman of the scriptures. The great beasts, as they stepped off the hidden path onto the safety of the desert sands, were urged into line with Namla between Helen and her lover. "Namla will ride 3 paces in front, Excellency," said Yusuf. "Ride at fullest speed until the first ray of the sun breaks through the clouds of night, keeping the great star behind the right shoulder. Then guide yourself by the sun as I have instructed you, and may Allah have you and yours in His keeping. I and mine eyes will overtake you if it is the will of Allah, whose prophet is Muhammad." The camels moved forward slowly, then gathering speed, sped across the desert. Yusuf and his eyes waited at the beginning of the path until the faint sound made by the beasts' huge feet upon the sand died away altogether, then turned and, Yusuf leading, retraced their steps across the hidden path. Allah guide them, little brother, for behold, my heart is soft towards those white people of great courage. Go thou and pit thy strength against that of the half-caste lion, so that his suspicions are not aroused, whilst I sit here to await the awakening of Zarah the Beautiful. He sat cross-legged before the door of the empty hut, from which, if he had had eyes, he could have seen the tombs of the Holy Fathers. He sat calmly, patiently, resigned to fate, until, as the sky lightened way down in the east, a dog, then another, and then a many began to bark. They barked without ceasing, whilst the grooms stirred in their sleep, and the voices and laughter of the men died down as they stopped to listen to the noise. Knowing that the barking of the dogs never failed to waken Zarah, Yusuf raised his sightless face to the heavens and offered a prayer of thanksgiving. The hour of his revenge was at hand. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Florence Short. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest, Chapter 22. Every man in his own care. Arabic proverb. Zarah stretched her arms above her head, yawned, listened for a moment to the barking of the dogs, then, struck with a premonition of impending disaster, awoke to her surroundings, struggled to a sitting position, and stared up at the unlit lamps and round the room in amazement. Save for the faint light of the coming dawn, the place was in darkness and strangely still. Who had blown out the lights? Where was Helen? What was the meaning of the dogs' unrest at this hour, when they usually slept? Why was she weighed down with such an oppressive drowsiness? She roused herself, swaying to her feet, stood for a moment bemused, then staggered forward and crashed into a great brass bowl filled with many fruits. It fell with a clatter, arousing her from the strange lethargy which seemed to cause the room to spin about her and to dull her active brain. She stood watching the oranges and pomegranates, figs, apricots, and peaches roll this way and that across the marble floor, then called for Helen. Helen! She shouted the name savagely, under the whip of her premonition, shouted it until the vaulted roof rang with her cries, shouted it until the echoes gave back the call. Helen, Helen, Helen. A mocking voice seemed to shout back from the shadows. In a flash, enlightenment came to her, and with it the blindest rage that ever entered woman's heart. There could be but one reason for the dark desertion of the room, and for the unanswered call. In some way the girl she hated, the man she desired, had communicated with each other, had outwitted her. How? When? Where? Oh, of what avail to lose time in asking useless questions, when, even at that moment, they might be on their way to freedom and love? She stood in the center of the faintly lighted room, then laughed until the ugly sound beat against the walls. She laughed with sheer rage at the thought of how she, Zarah the Cruel, the most beautiful woman in Asia, the woman who had never been thwarted or fouled, had at last been circumvented by Helen Raynor, the fool English girl, the slow-witted, the dense, the hopelessly dull, as she had described her when holding her up to ridicule to her women slaves. Her slaves. In a moment her trend of thought changed, and with it, replacing even her rage, came a violent desire to revenge herself on everyone who had connived at or participated in the prisoner's escape. Yusuf! Namla! She seized the metal rod and smote the huge brass gong as the two names leapt to her mind. Her men were gathered together on the plateau, with Yusuf and the dumb boy whom he loved. In their midst, she would summon the two who had been thorns in her flesh since the death of the sheikh, and wring a confession from them, left by her father in her care. In the name of Allah, what mattered a promise more or less when it had to do with those who had put humiliation after humiliation upon her? She would see to it that they and the white people were rendered dumb and blind in death by the time she had wiped out all the insults they had heaped her with. Her women. They slept peacefully in their quarters with Namla in their midst. She would summon them all and wring a confession from her. She had treated the body woman, who had shown such strong affection for the white girl, with a strange leniency, merely replacing her, upon the spy's report, by the surly negress who had so unaccountably disappeared upon the night when the dogs had rushed the hall. She should learn what awaited a slave and a prisoner who dared plot against the master. She smote the gong to awaken the entire camp, and to summon her attendants, smote it without ceasing. Lost to all sense of reasoning through her overpowering rage, she flung herself upon the divan and sat looking out to the desert through the cleft in the mountains, planning her revenge upon them all. The red desert, the empty desert, the forcing ground of hate, revenge, despair, the burial place of love and hope and life. The great waste places of the Arabian Peninsula, swept by the tribes of Ad, Tassim, and Yadis, devastated by the hordes which inundated it in the early days when the Holy Fathers, in penance, built the very building in which the desert-born girl sat. Ruled by African kings, allied to the Roman and Byzantine empires, coveted, conquered, beaten, yet as ready today to rise in revolt against oppression and to hurl itself against the enemy as it was ready to fling itself victoriously against the mighty Roman generals. Immense tracts of sand across which, pursuing or pursued, passed those countless legions, leaving, save for the footprints of Solomon's mighty Yemenite queen and Mohammed, the greatest prophet the world has known since the advent of the gentle Nazarene, but little mark upon the path of time. Desolate plains under which those who, through the centuries, have laid its fair cities waste, sleep in death amongst the ruins and treasures and secrets of cities, kingdoms and dynasties, of which the names alone remain. Silent, mysterious oceans of sand, above which, wheeling, calling, sailing on outstretched wing at dawn, at noon, at dusk, drift the vultures from north to south, from east to west, as they have drifted and called since the day every grain of the sands was numbered. Revengeful, relentless, restless, the great desert knows no peace, nor rest, nor shade. It sweeps flat that which it piled high but yesterday, and upon its surface, stretching like an eastern carpet, blows its sands to the height of hills, to sweep them flat again. It kills with thirst, it slays with hunger and exhaustion. It leaves but little trace of those who dare to pass its desolate boundaries. Bones of fugitives, of the hapless, the luckless, bones of birds and beasts, covered feet deep with sand at dawn, uncovered by the dread Shalok, to dance to the blowing of its scorching breath at noon, mark out a path across its desolation under the star-strewn, peaceful sky. High-born and low-caste, criminal and holy man, friend and enemy, there is nothing to tell who they were in life, nor in what manner death came to them. Vultures follow jackal and hyena, settle for a while and rise again to drift from north to south, from east to west. The wind of chance wafts the tattered, blood-stained kerchief across the desert to the feet of the holy man who has watched it, the only thing to move, dancing this way and that across the plain towards him. He ties it as a pennant to his staff and continues, with a prayer for the soul of the dead, upon his pilgrimage. The Bedouin, starving upon a handful of stringy seheni dates and a cup of brackish water, searches amongst the bones, and offers the desert victims purse and amulets and weapons in exchange or sale to those he may encounter upon his journey to the nearest oasis. A fitting place indeed in which to hide all trace of the Arabians' vengeance upon the white people. Let them fly for their lives. They would but leave their bodies to the vultures and the wind and the starving Bedouin when her men had done with them. Her men! Since the sinking of the last moon, her spies had brought reports of discontent amongst them. They had become restless and rebellious under the inactivity she imposed upon them during her fleeting but violent obsession for the white man. Within the hour she would once more lead them across the sands under the light of the dying night and the coming dawn. With her they should hunt the fugitives down, and with spear or rifle wipe out the cause of their unrest and anger. Born of the desert, bred in its scorching heat, Zarah made one with it in her relentless cruelty. In it she had found her joy, and what counted more to her than all, her greatest triumphs with her men. Through it love, the love which is passion, the only love of which she was capable, had come to her. In it, in years to come, death would find her. Death. She laughed aloud as she listened to the sound of her people calling to each other as they hastened from their quarters to obey her summons. Death would come, as it must come to all, but not until she had repaired the mistake she had made in endeavoring to place the white man at the head of her small but turbulent kingdom. Not until she had ruled for many years. Not until she had wiped the memory of the white people who had tricked her from the minds of her subjects, whom she would link closer still by her union with one of themselves. With all the instability and inconstancy of the Arab blood in her veins, her passion for the white man passed, burned out in the fire of the wrath that consumed her. Let the white people die. Let the slight ripple they had made upon the sea of her exuberant, triumphant life be wiped out, so that peace might once more reign in the sanctuary. Death. With her plan of revenge in her mind, she looked across at her throwing spears hanging upon the wall, then laughed as she caught sight of herself in one of the many long mirrors her intense vanity had caused her to place about the room. As she crossed the floor, she made the gesture with her fingers, used by the superstitious all the world over, against the thought of death which filled her mind, then took her favorite spear from the wall. Damascus steel, inlaid with gold, with razor edges to the slender needle-pointed blade. She smiled as the thought of the day, those years ago, when with it she had transfixed the greyhound, accepted as a gift by her father's guest. "Death!" she cried, as she stood a magnificent figure of youth, with the spear raised and poised for throwing. "Nay, revenge upon those who try to humiliate me. I will gather my men together and will promise gold, horses, women, what they will, to those who overtake and bring back to me, alive or dead, the prisoners who have escaped. Love. I in love with any man, be he white or black or of mixed blood. Nay, by the beard of the prophet, I love naught but power. Let them flee into the desert, even until the sun is risen. So that Helen Rayner's countenance be blistered, and as roundly swelled as yon knob of wood, the which, to see if my hand hath not lost its cunning, I will pierce with the spear." She ran back a space, caught her foot in a rug, staggered, and in an effort to recover her balance, involuntarily flung the spear. She stood for a moment petrified with horror, then screamed and screamed until the place rang. Thrown off her balance, she had flung the spear straight at the mirror. As she stood, it transfixed her reflection through the heart. Hundreds of torches flared below, where her men stood looking up, watching the women as, with exclamations of fear, they ran to answer the dreaded summons of the gong. "By the beard," said Bowlegs to Yusuf's eyes, "something is amiss." A shout went up as Zarah appeared, wrapped in her great riding cloak, spear in hand. "She leads us to battle, little brother who cannot speak." Bowlegs turned, laughing as he spoke, and stared in amazement. The dumb youth was not there, but in his place towered the gigantic Nubian. "Verily to battle or the hunt, brother?" said Alisad. "Battle, methinks, for of a truth the woman I love seems in no patient mood. Ha! Canst hear? She calleth for Namla. Ha! She smite that Abyssinian across the mouth. The tiger cat! Yet do I love her the more for her cruelty. Her small hand is like a flower petal blown against the rock, when, in her childlike wrath, she smites me. I could pinch the breath from her throat, which is like unto the jewelled column in yon hall, twixt thumb and finger. Yet love I to anger her, so that her little hand shall smite me. Ha! Hearken! She calleth for the blind one, for Yusuf. Look, brother, is she not as the wind from the south in her wrath? Zarah faced her terrified women slaves, amongst whom Namla was not to be found. Search for the white woman, you black dogs. She smote the Abyssinian across the face as she spoke. Find her and bring her to me. Namla will you find with her. Search, all of you, and hasten, lest I drive you down to the sands of death. The women turned and fled down the steps, touching their amulets, praying to Allah, whispering the one to the other. Whither, my heart's delight? Whither in such haste, with thy beautiful countenance distraught with fear? Bowleg's second wife tore herself from his detaining grasp and ran as fast as her weight would allow her, and literally for her life. We run in search of the white woman, who is not to be found, and Namla, who... The rest of her words were lost as she disappeared in the throng of her panting sisters. "Oh ho!" said Bowlegs. "Now find we the kernel and the nut. The beautiful Zarah calleth for Yusuf." He turned and scanned the band of laughing, interested men. "Behold, are the blind and the dumb ones not to be seen? Let me hide in thy shadow, O lion, lest thy mate-to-be scratches out mine eyes as she passes." Alisad took no notice. He stood watching the beautiful Arabian as she ran down the steps. The men made a passage for her and closed in behind and around her as she passed between them, wrapped in her riding cloak. "Yusuf," she said sharply, "where is he? Thou who standeth above thy fellows, seest thou him?" She laid her hand on Alisad's arm as she spoke, and looked up into his eyes, which were alight with love. "Is he here?" The wind blew her cloak against him. Starving for love, he caught it and held it crushed in his hand, and stood looking down at her, whilst the men, intuitive as are all Orientals, watched the little scene, pressing close upon each other. "Her veritable mate," whispered one. "Seest thou that his right hand holds her cloak? Yea, I bear no malice towards the white man, but 'twere well to send him with the white woman back to the country where the white race is bred," answered the patriarch. "Seest thou Yusuf? Yusuf guards the white man, O Zarah," said Alisad slowly. "Bring him and the white man. Hasten thou." She pointed with her spear at a youngster who, terrified, turned and ran towards the men's quarters. "My amulet for a death in battle against thine, for many sons amongst thy children," whispered the patriarch, "that the lad finds neither the blind one, nor the dumb one, nor the white man." The gamblers slipped their amulets from about their necks. "Thinkest thou that they have escaped, O father?" "Nay, that I know not. But the bitch that so hateth our woman ruler turned from her meat and howled thrice at the moon. Naught but death can follow the sign." From fear of disaster amongst the dogs, she had been separated from her companions and placed by herself for the night in the small kennel amongst the rocks. "Aye," whispered his companion, spreading his fingers against disaster. "Behold, The lad returneth, with a face like troubled waters. The lad flung himself at Zarah's feet, speechless from terror. Speak, where are they? Zarah kicked him as he lay, and turned and half raised her spear in the direction from which had come a murmuring. The dwelling of the white man is empty, O mistress. Neither is the blind one nor the dumb one to be found for the searching. Make a way for yon black dog. Zarah's voice, high-pitched in fury, rose above the men's. They pushed each other back as the gigantic negress came running lightly and smote her playfully upon her broad shoulders as she passed amongst them, up to where her mistress and the Nubian stood. Almost as tall as Al-Assad, she made a superb picture as she stood, thoroughbred and perfect in form, beside the two half-castes, arrogant in her breeding, aware of the rebellion seething in the camp. She eyed them insolently as she revenged herself for the blows her mistress had rained upon her since she had been bought in the slave market. Thy prisoners have escaped, O Zarah, she said slowly, contemptuously. The white man has fled with the white woman, black stallion with black mare, white stallion with white mare, and Allah's curse upon the fold of different coloring. She turned her back upon the Arabian and walked away with the insolent gait of the thoroughbred Negro. Speechless with rage, Zarah raised her spear, then, in a flash, realized that she no longer had the power to move her men to the madness of hate or to the lust of battle. They stood between her and the negress, but she kept her spear raised as she made a mighty effort to regain her hold over them. She stepped back and shouted the battle cry with which she had been wont to gather the men for a foray into the desert or about her in battle. The words were echoed 1,000 times from the mountains, but not from one throat of the men about her. She called aloud her promise of horses, gold, or women as a reward for the capture of the prisoners. She drove away between the men until she stood upon the outer edge of the throng. Then once more she shouted the battle cry until the women, who had been watching, ran and hid amongst the rocks, and some of the younger men felt stealthily for their knives. Is there not one among you who dare face the white man? A voice from the center of the throng quoted an Arab proverb, a voice with a mocking note in its clear tones. It is written upon the cucumber leaf, O Zarah, that from a house from which thou eatest, thou shalt not pray for its destruction. The patriarch, with bow legs at his side, pushed his way to the front. The white man, my daughter, we will not for master, he said, but for his patience and his strength, yea, and his love for his own woman. We love him as brother. Behold, has he lived and eaten like a dog in yon hut, and worked amongst us, to teach us his tricks of skill, with no word of complaint upon his lips? Nay, let him be, with his own woman. Their ways are not our ways, and their lives are in the keeping of Allah, the one and only God. Likewise let the friend of thy father with his dumb friend be gone upon their own business. They irk the sanctuary with their infirmities, as does the busy Namla with her wailings for her lost son. But Zarah had long since passed the stage of sane reasoning. She was white with fury as she faced these men who would not move hand or foot to help her in her need, and looked at her with laughter in the depths of their mocking eyes. Thou! Her voice trembled with rage as she looked across to Al-Assad, who stood surrounded by men. He shook his head. Thou art my woman, he said simply, and if I cannot have thee, thinkest thou that I would strive to bring back one thou lovest and who has escaped? Thou fool, bring him back dead, slung across thy shoulders. Nay, I love him as a brother. Let him go. Then will I bring him back myself. The men looked at each other as she laughed shrilly and turned and ran across the plateau towards the stables and gripped the Nubian as he made a movement to follow her. Let her be, said the patriarch. She but makes mocks of thee. What can a woman armed with a spear do against those who are fully armed? She will hide amongst the rocks until hunger drives her forth. Then will we wed her to thee, O brother, or carry her to the sands of death, for we tire of her moods, and would find her a master. But Zarah was in no vein for trickery. Desperation had swept her completely off her course towards the whirlpool of impulsiveness into which the hot-headed flounder to struggle, sink, and drown. A moment's thought, a whole-hearted surrender to her subjects' wishes, a joke at her own expense, a laugh, and she might even then have won back her hold upon the men who, as all Arabs, were swayed by the emotions of the moment and as easily placated as they were easily roused. Her love had passed. The mockery in her men's eyes, the insolence in the black slave's words, signaled her defeat. The future, bereft of power, loomed cold and barren. Yet, in the smart of the wound dealt her colossal vanity, she gave no thought to aught but swift, sure revenge upon those who had been the chief cause of her downfall. The grooms of the stables, standing halfway down the slight incline, devoured by curiosity, fled at the sight of her, and rushed to their quarters at the back of the buildings. She paid no attention. Time pressed, and she required but a halter rope with which to guide Lula, the fastest mare in all Arabia, across the desert. There was no necessity for questioning. The fresh tracks of the camels or horses ridden by the fugitives would show plainly on the sand in the light of the coming day. In the agony of her humiliation, she gave no thought to weapons. All she wanted was to find the white man with his woman, to get within spear range, and then to leave the rest to Allah the merciful and compassionate. Terrified at the gleam of the white cloak, Lula backed across the loose box, then lashed out until it seemed she must break the partition with her dainty unshod hoofs. Her beautiful, soft eyes rolled as she backed into the corner, and she jerked her head, lifting Zarah from the ground. When the Arabian caught her by the halter rope, she stood quite still for a moment, snuffing at the cloak, then suddenly rushed for the open door and bolted, slipping, sliding, with the girl running at her side, down the passage between the stalls, through the outer door, and out on to the broad ledge upon which the stables had been built. She reared when Zarah vaulted to her back. Then, exhilarated by the dawn, and under the pressure of the girl's knees, danced sideways towards the edge, whilst the men who watched the splendid picture held Al-Assad forcibly, and Yusuf's eyes, peeping from behind the rock which hid them, tapped in answer to the blind man's question. The black mare reared until struck between the ears, when she crashed to her feet, slipped them over the edge, tried to regain her foothold, then, under her own impetus and the pressure of the girl's knees, who was too savagely impatient to pull the beautiful beast back to the main track, slithered like a goat down the path from the stables to where it joined the upward track which led to the cleft. Zarah took her up the steep incline at a terrific rush, and pulled her at the top until she reared again. For one instant they stood sharply outlined against the night sky, in which the morning breeze blew out the stars one by one, then vanished as the battle cry, mocking, challenging, rang through the air, down to the men standing close together upon the plateau. His eyes, who watched, turned and tapped a message upon his blind friend's arm. "To the kennels?" answered Yusuf. "Yea, verily will we hasten, whilst our brothers and sisters gossip of the flight. Zarah, the merciful, will have no time in which to spy the swiftest dromedary in Arabia hidden behind the rocks." He raised his right hand as he spoke. "By the honor of the Arab, when I have finished with her who plucked the light from my eyes, behold, will her laughter be as the laughter of the nut when cracked between two stones." He laughed savagely as he quoted the proverb, staring down at the boy he could not see, then took his hand and, without faltering, passed quickly along a path he had made for himself between the rocks up to the kennels, deserted for the moment by the grooms, who had rushed to talk over the doings of the past hour with the distracted grooms of the stables.
Allah, keep her tongue still,
whispered Yusuf, as his eyes opened the door of the isolated kennel amongst the rocks and softly whistled the bitch. Whimpering with delight, the beautiful creature flung herself upon the men whom she had so often followed across the desert. She loved them. They had petted her while in disgrace, and had fed her with bones between the regulation and none too satisfying meals. Yusuf's hour of revenge had struck. Vengeance for the loss of his eyes, for the mutilation of his once handsome face, for the humiliations which had deftly been heaped upon him throughout the years by the woman who had failed to recognize the intensity of his hate for her. For just such a moment had he longed and prayed. For just such a moment had he fostered the hate of the bitch, who, only on account of her unblemished pedigree, and for the gentleness of her ways to all but the Arabian, had not been destroyed long since. 4 years she had followed the scent of one of the Arabian's discarded sandals, which his eyes had trailed upon a string across the desert, mile upon mile, to be rewarded at the end by some dainty fastened to a staff, thrust into the sand, for which he had been taught to leap and fight. She knew the way down the narrow path to the spear stuck fast between the 2 rocks, and had never forgotten the severe lessons which had taught her to keep silent until well out in the desert. She whimpered softly and thrust her muzzle into Yusuf's hand as he passed quickly to the rock which marked the beginning of the path leading to the cleft. They gamble, thou sayest. Mine eyes, seated upon the ground, with the lion a prisoner in their midst. Then, bending low, will we make our way to the cleft, praying to Allah to bind their eyes to the dice until we can no longer be seen. How light is it? As light as the feathers upon a pigeon's breast. Then we must hasten. Bent double, they crept up the steep path to the cleft, through which Yusuf passed, just as the first sunbeam shot from behind the edge of the world, and a great shout rang out from the plateau. Al-Assad, chafing under the restraint put upon him, and longing for the woman he loved, turned to look up at the cleft through which she must pass upon her return. Outlined against the sky, he saw the disappearing figure of the blind man, whom he knew hated the woman he loved with a bitterness beyond description. Upon the near side he saw, waiting to pass, Yusuf's eyes, holding the bitch who hated the Arabian with a hatred which equaled that of the blind man. The men leapt to their feet at Al-Assad's cry and flung themselves upon him, then fell back when, making a bugle of his slender hands, he sent the battle cry ringing over the mountain tops out to the desert. At the sight of the bitch he had divined the revenge Yusuf the blind had planned. He sent the battle cry to reach the woman he loved, so that she should know that help was coming. Again and again he called, until the birds rose twittering and screaming in flocks and flew towards the sunrise, whilst Yusuf whistled to the bitch trotting at the dromedary's heels, as the great beast, under the urging of the dumb youth, passed along the hidden path at a desperate, dangerous speed. The women rushed from their quarters at the sound of the battle cry, which invariably heralded the death of one or more of their menfolk, and beat their breasts as they watched the men, headed by the Nubian, running towards the stables. Ay, 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 ay. Their lamentation rose to high heaven as they watched the Nubian take his stallion at a terrific pace down the short cut to the path. They screamed when the magnificent beast fell and rolled to the bottom, where he scrambled to his feet and limped forward a foot or so, whilst Al-Assad, without hesitating, sped to meet the men as they tore like the whirlwind down the made track. He caught the rope halter of one who outdistanced the rest, and, putting out all his almost superhuman strength, stopped the horse dead in its tracks and hurled it back on its haunches. Clinging to the mane with his left hand, he lifted the rider with his right, flung him to the ground, bent and snatched the spear from his hand, and ran at the stallion's side up to the end of the path, where he vaulted across its back and disappeared through the cleft with a challenging cry. Afraid of the Arab who lay stunned across their path, the foremost horses stopped dead in their headlong career, bringing the others up against them in a struggling mass, so that much time was lost as the men tried to straighten out the confusion made by the horses jamming on the narrow path as each struggled to free itself from its neighbor, whilst they slipped and reared and fell. The rim of the sun had just shone above the horizon. The Nubian was a speck in the far distance of Yusuf and his eyes, and the Arabian. There was no sign in the shadows which still shrouded the vast ocean of sand, when, headed by the patriarch, with much shouting and firing of rifles, the whole band, riding at full speed, swept across the desert. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Florence Short. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Chapter 23. Remove the gates of thy stable to another side. Arabic proverb. An ominous dawning, misty, silvery shadows fleeing before the coming light left no mark upon the crimson desert, which stretched to the east and west, a desolate, unbroken plain. To the north and south, in motionless, blood-red waves of sand. Sunrays, yellow, orange, red, spread like gigantic searchlights across the sky from behind a mass of clouds which the west wind had driven eastward and piled low down upon the horizon. Copper-colored masses against a background of green and rose and dun, concealing the end or the beginning of an arch of clouds which flared, a signal of disaster, a pennant of death, blood-red, high across the sapphire firmament, where one great star still defied its enemy, the dawn. Over the empty plain, under the ominous arc, straight towards the stupendous sunrise, fled the 3 camels, leaving a dead-black trail stretching back as far as eye could see. Namla, the body woman, glanced over her shoulder at the morning star and touched the amulet of good luck which hung about her neck. She looked round at the ill-omened sky and back over the miles across which the huge beasts had raced, at the almost incredible speed to which the camel can attain when urged to its greatest effort. Scarcely a word had the riders said since the sky had lightened when, wondering if the alarm had been given in the camp, they had turned to see if Yusuf overtook or if Zarah pursued them through the misty, silvery shadows. Ralph and Helen rode side by side, their dromedaries almost touching as they raced death for their lives, their liberty, their love. Namla, the desert-born, rode ahead, steering her course unerringly by the great star. She glanced back at Helen's face, showing death white in the shadows of the passing night, and distressed at the signs of a great fatigue. Anxious to advise, to help, touched her camel upon the right shoulder, so that it turned to the right in a wide circle, whilst its companions, ignoring or totally unconscious of their leader's change of route, and utterly lacking in imagination, reasoning power, or sense of any kind, forged ahead on a non-stop run. Once more her keen eyes swept the vast plain which lay behind and across, which, like a band of jet on damask cloth, showed the path made by the camels in their flight. She made no sound as she shaded her eyes and stared into the far distance, but touched the amulet for good luck, which hung at her own neck, and, leaning far forward, touched the amulet which had been fastened in a tuft of hair on the camel's left shoulder, thereby guaranteeing its safe arrival at the journey's end. O thou who troublest thyself about the care of others, to whom hast thou left thine own cares? she muttered the proverb, then prayed to Allah as she smote the camel so that it finished the half circle and formed up with its companions, which utterly ignored its return. "What is it, Namla?" Helen leant sideways as she spoke to the body servant, in whose eyes she had seen the light of a great fear, then turned and looked back in the direction in which the woman pointed. She turned to her lover and pointed back along the path by which they had come, to where, hardly discernible as a mere speck in the far distance, something moved. "We're followed, Ra," she cried, leaning towards him and stretching out her hand. "I know we are, sweetheart. I've known it for some time. Let's hope it's Yusuf." He smiled at Namla and shouted across to her, "We'll put up a good fight, little sister, if they overtake us, and I swear they shall never take you two women alive." "Kismet, Excellency," cried Namla. "Perchance 'tis the blind one riding to join us, though verily there is but Lula who could overtake these three beasts, the swiftest in the Yed. And the black mare Yusuf does not ride. I pray thee let me have speech with Zarah if 'tis she, before death claims either the one or the other of us. Likewise, if so be it is the will of Allah, allow me to approach the tyrant." She spat as she made her request and guided her camel close to Helen's and prayed to Allah, with frequent interludes of cursing, as they fled like the wind towards a spot whence they would turn due north and, if Allah the Merciful answered the prayers of the body woman, would overtake a caravan journeying towards Oman or Harik. "'Tis the birds of prey, Excellency," she said later, "calling as they ever call at dawn. Perchance from the heavens the eagles and the vultures spy food with which to break their fast." Helen looked up at the sky, across which drifted and wheeled vultures, eagles, hawks, and shook her head and smiled at the dusky little woman who lied to allay her fears. "Nay, Namla, it is a voice, it is. Listen." Faintly but clearly the cry came to them upon the morning wind. Helen looked at her lover, and Namla bent and touched the amulet upon the camel's shoulder so as to hide her eyes. The battle cry, derisive, challenging, even at a great distance, left no doubt as to who pursued them. But Namla was of the desert, with the eyes of a hawk and the tenacity of those whose daily life is one long fight against the greatest odds. She shaded her eyes suddenly and stared ahead. She pointed and laughed and kicked her camel vigorously. But there was no sign of living thing in all the desert to Ralph and Helen when they looked to where she pointed. "I see nothing, Namla." "Yonder, Excellency, see you not a band of men moving many, many miles away? Allah, their backs are towards us. They go from us." She turned in her saddle and shook her fist at the speck in the far distance, then put her hand to her ear. "Allah, 'tis verily a horse. Faster, faster, Excellencies, urge the camels. They but crawl. Urge them, for in yon band of men, be they robbers or starving Bedouins, lies our salvation." Infinitesimal spots upon the desert, which ridged and wrinkled, lay like the outstretched hand of fate. They urged the dromedaries until they fled to outstrip the wind under the sky of violent coloring. "Allah, open their eyes that they see us. Open their ears that they hear us." "Excellency, Excellency, is there no way by which to turn their heads towards us?" Her words were lost in the rush of the tremendous speed, but Helen, understanding the expressive gestures, turned and shouted to her lover. The camels paid no heed when the desert rang with the double report of Trenchard's revolver, but Abdul, who journeyed in the company of the Bedouins who had succoured him in the hope of learning news of his white master in Harik, turned in his saddle and looked back, whilst Zarah, oblivious of the strain she was putting upon the mare, shouted the battle cry derisively when the firing shattered the desert stillness and drove the beautiful creature at full speed over the sands, urging her with needle-pointed spear. Nor did she look back, else might she have seen fate pressing hard upon her heels. On the day of victory no fatigue is felt. Arabic proverb. like a darker shadow amongst the shadows thrown upon the desert from the ill-omened sky. Radi, the bitch, the swiftest greyhound whelped in Hassa, loped alongside the dromedary ridden by Yusuf, with his eyes, pillion-wise, behind him. She barely left a mark upon the sand, so lightly did she run, perplexed, upon a track which held but the common scent of horse and camel. True, she ran in the wake of Lula, her stable friend, but of enemy there was no trace. Therefore, of what avail to spend her strength in chasing shadows by the light of the rising sun? His eyes frowned when she broke away, like an arrow from a bow set off hard upon the scent of something which had crossed the path after Lula the mare. "She has no interest, brother." He tapped his message upon the blind man's shoulder. "Even now she turns to follow the scent of some small beast of no account. Give me the sandal of Zarah the Cruel, so that she holds in her fine nose the scent of the woman of whom as yet we see no sign, but whom we hunt to the death." Yusuf sent a long, low call ringing across the sands, and Radi, with every muscle in her gaunt body trained to a hair, without checking her speed, spun round upon her hind feet and tore back in answer to it. She ran at an angle to overtake the black dromedary, whose price was above that of many rubies, and recognizing the object dangled just out of reach, leapt at the sandal, missing it by an inch. Then, as trained to do, on touching the ground, turned in a circle to the right, and at the top of her terrific speed, still at an angle, tore towards the dromedary and launched herself straight upon its back. Catching her by the throat, the dumb youth held her back, whilst with claws clinging to the tufts of hair upon the dromedary's haunches, the bitch fought to reach the sandal, the scent of which drove her to a veritable madness of hate and filled her with a lust to kill. She had it between her teeth when firing suddenly shattered the desert stillness, and she fought like fury to keep it, until his eyes, putting out all his strength, hurled her to the ground, and clasping Yusuf round the waist, leaned far sideways and stared ahead. In his excitement he snatched the mihian from the blind man's hand, leaning backwards, smote the dromedary above the fleshy part of its hind leg, above the knee, the tenderest spot of its tough anatomy, so that with a scream of rage increased its pace seemingly 100-fold, and tore like a hurricane of wrath upon the path, at the far end of which his eyes at last discerned a moving figure. "Bismi Allah!" yelled Yusuf, answering the message tapped upon his shoulder. "Allah the merciful delivereth the tyrant into our hands. The mare faileth, sayest thou? The marks of her hoofs show ever deeper in the sand. Whence came the firing? From Zarah the Cruel, or from our white brother, who fleeth with the woman before her vengeance? Nay, nay, knowest thou so little? Canst not discern the difference twixt a pistol and a rifle? Allah strike her hand so that it is useless, and strike the mare dead so that the woman falls to the hound, who hates her even as I hate her in my blindness." He leaned down and called to the greyhound, exciting her with words as he pointed ahead, until, sensing an enemy at last, she shot in front of the dromedary. Then, sitting erect, he lifted his mutilated face to the flaming heavens, and chanted verses from the Koran to the honor of Allah, the one and only God, who delivered the enemy into his hands. "Flight shall not profit you if ye fly from death or from slaughter, and if it would, yet shall ye not enjoy this world but a little. Who is he who shall defend you against God, if he is pleased to bring evil on you? O Lord, give her the double of our punishment, and curse her with a heavy curse." The sonorous words range out on the stillness, barely broken by the patting of the dromedary's cushioned feet upon the sand. Then he stopped suddenly, alert, apprehensive. His hearing, sharpened by his blindness, had caught the sound of the drumming of a horse's hoofs upon the sand many miles behind. Look once more behind, little brother. Methought 'twould not be long before her lover rode in pursuit. Ha! Thou seest one riding like a leaf before the wind. By the beard, 'tis the lion riding to find his mate. Allah smite that which he bestrides, so that no harm befalls him. He turned round in the saddle and steered back along the path he could not see. Seest thou aught else behind the lion, little brother? Far behind thou seest naught. Yet is there a sound of thunder in mine ears, even the sound of the hoofs of many horses tearing like the hurricane towards us. He listened for a moment, then turned again and stared unseeingly in front towards the figure of the woman who had blinded him. He smiled as best he could for the distortion of his mouth and threw back his head. Zarah looked back at last as the challenge of the battle cry came to her on the wind, and, recognizing that speed alone would save her from the death which hunted her down, drove her spear into the mare's hindquarters. The exhausted beast, ridden without mercy, her satiny coat dripping, her chest a-smother with foam, bounded forward under the agony of the goad, crossed her feet, stumbled, flinging Zarah over her head as she crashed to her knees, then, up before the Arabian could rise, turned and fled into the desert towards the east, where the sun showed above the clouds. 1 hour for thy love, 1 hour for thy Lord. Arabic proverb. A mighty picture made Al-Assad and the stallion as they rode in the race to outstrip death. To aid the magnificent beast as it tore across the plain, the Nubian lay close to its satin neck, guiding with knees and hand, coaxing and urging with his voice as it fled. Ventre terre, silken mane and tail flying like banners in the wind. There was naught but vision to tell him if he gained upon the dog or not, and even in that he dared not put his trust. For how was he to tell of the figures before him, the camel with its 2 riders, the dog ahead, the girl upon the black mare still farther off, and the 3 camels, mere dots upon the horizon, became gradually clearer because the stallion lessened the distance between itself and them, or because the light made all things clearer as the sun rose from behind the clouds. He did not count Yusuf nor the dumb youth in the race for Sarah's life. A great brotherly love existed between them, protecting them from harm one from the other. Nor did he blame the blind man for taking his revenge by setting the bitch to hunt the girl down. In his wild heart and simple mind, love, hate, and revenge were inextricably interwoven in the web of life, circumstance alone deciding which should triumph in the end. He would overtake them easily and pass them with a friendly shout as he rapidly lessened the distance which separated him from love and freedom. His plan was of the simplest. He would lift the woman he loved into his arms and ride away with her to some distant part of the desert. There he would gather the fiercest outlaws to him, and with them raid the country until his name should become a byword in the land, whilst his riches should accumulate, so that his woman's happiness should be great. He smiled as he rode with his dreams in his heart, and his eyes upon the greyhound and the spear loose in his hand. He knew that the Bedouins, who had seen Radi hunting across the desert, had come to swear by her endurance and resistance, and to boast to the stranger within the land of how she hunted the night through without water or food or rest. Likewise she held an unbroken record. She had never failed to kill. He looked down at Lula's hoofprints and called to the stallion as he caressed the glossy neck. The mare's hoofprints showed deeper and deeper, and in 2 places where she had crossed her feet under the strain of a great fatigue. For speed she was renowned throughout the peninsula, but in endurance the lowest hireling from the bazaar could beat her. And behind her ran the greyhound, which had never been known to fail in a kill. He felt the stallion's pace increase as he stroked the glossy neck. Then, clutching the silvery mane, he swung, head down, listening to a sound which had come to him along the sand, even above the pounding of the stallion's hoofs. He swung himself erect and turned and looked along the path marked out by those who fled and those who pursued. Led by the patriarch, the men of the sanctuary, stretched out in a line across the horizon, raced towards him. They rode with the lance at rest, and shouted as they rode, until the heavens were filled with the sound of their voices and the thunder of their horses' hoofs. There was no help to be sought of them. They rode in the joy of the hunt, in the hope of a kill, just as they had ridden to the attack upon the white man's camp, led by the woman who had revolted them at last with her tyranny, and who, in the secret places of their inconstant hearts, they hoped would die rather than the white man and the white woman who fled before her. Then fate jerked the strings which hobbled them all to their destiny. Al-Assad, riding with his eyes upon the greyhound, looked up and ahead when Yusuf's challenging cry came to him on the wind. Breathlessly he watched for an instant of time, then sat back and raised his spear as the mare stumbled and flung Zarah to the ground. In an unconscious effort to catch the mare, he pulled the stallion to the left, then pressed the beast hard with his right knee, bringing it back to the path, and touched its neck with the tip of the needle-pointed spear, so that it leaped forward under the unexpected goad, and hurled himself on the track of the greyhound, which tore like the wind to where the girl stood. The half-caste just glanced at Yusuf and his eyes, as their dromedary suddenly left the path and sped away across the desert. He knew the dromedary was being driven along a circuitous route by which it would ultimately join up with the white people. He knew that Yusuf felt sure of his revenge, and had left the end to the will of Allah. He felt no hatred in his heart as he looked after them, fleeing to the safety which was their birthright. He felt no anger as he raised his spear above his head so that it glittered in the risen sun, and shouted the battle cry as he drove the stallion to the rescue of the girl who stood alone, so far away, facing him and the greyhound who had never failed to kill. He turned for an instant to look at the men who followed hard upon his track, magnificent in his desperate need, his face alight with the glow of battle. He raised his spear in answer to the patriarch, who raised his in salutation, and raised it again in greeting to the men, his friends. A day which is not thine, do not reckon it as of thy life. Arabic proverb. With the fatalism of the Arab, Zarah stood watching the race between the greyhound and the man who loved her. She had glanced at the black dromedary carrying blind Yusuf and his eyes to freedom. She had looked at the magnificent sight of the men she had ruled so tyrannically, as they deployed so that they should encircle her when they reached her. She did not turn to look in the direction taken by the girl she hated and the man she had loved passionately and for so brief a time, yet did hate outweigh the danger of the hour. By Allah, she cried, lifting her spear, if I live, I will lead my men upon them, and trample them, and those who help them, under foot. Yea, by the honor of the Arab I swear, if I throw the spear so that it pierces the heart of yon cursed dog, that not one of them shall be left alive within the hour. She dropped her white cloak from her shoulders and stepped clear, weighing the slender spear as she measured the lessening distance between the stallion and the greyhound. Her heart quickened not one beat, nor did the slightest shadow of fear show in the tawny eyes. She did not despair as the bitch seemed to gain upon the stallion. She did not hope as the thunder of the stallion's hoofs sounded clearer and clearer every moment. She was alone in her hour of desperate need, and only upon the strength and skill of her right hand and the judgment of her eye could she depend for life if the Nubian failed to reach her in time. Yet even when that life trembled in the balance, she could not refrain from tormenting the man who had been her willing, humble slave from the moment his eyes had first met hers, and who alone raced to help her in her peril. She held out her arms towards him and called his name and smiled, even though she could almost see the red gleam of hate in the greyhound's eyes, so near was the revengeful beast. "Al-Assad," she called. "Al-Assad." Her voice sounded like a peal of bells in the desert stillness. Her beauty flamed like the sky above. Her courage was superb as she measured the distance between herself and the maddened greyhound. Then she leant forward and screamed till the echo of the terrible sound carried to Yusuf's ears, so that he turned and looked back in the direction of the girl he could not see. Death was upon her, death with a crown of red above its snow-white face, the death Yusuf had prophesied when she had struck him blind. She ran back so that the white cloak stretched between. She looked round and up to the sun which was her birthright, forward to the closing of her day. She flung out her arms, her hands, fingers wide spread as though to clutch the last moments of the life she loved so well. Life was nigh spent. She stood within the shadows of eternity. But, true to her father's race, true to the relentless desert to which she belonged, she would die fighting. She shouted the battle cry as she raised her spear. "Istashil, Istashil, Istashil." The desperate, defiant words were carried across the sands as she flung the spear, flung it as Roddy, the bitch, increasing her speed in a last desperate effort to revenge her pup, changed her course by a few inches, so that the spear barely grazed the shoulder as it flew past and buried itself in the sands. Then fear came to Zarah the Cruel, not the fear of death, but fear of an ignominious end in the eyes of her men. "Kill me, Al-Assad, kill me," she called desperately to the Nubian as she caught the bitch by the throat as she leapt upon her. "Kill me, kill me, kill me." The terrible cry rang in the Nubian's ears as, misjudging his strength, he hurled the spear even as the greyhound leapt. He shouted with triumph as the greyhound fell back dead, then flung himself from the stallion as he swept past at full speed and threw himself upon the girl he loved as she lay still. The point of the spear which had killed the greyhound had buried itself in Zarah's heart. He did not hear the shouting of the men as they swept down upon him from every side. He did not seem to see the sun in the heavens as he knelt and drew the weapon free. He did not hear the call of life as he lifted the girl and held her against his heart. "Zarah," he whispered softly, holding her gently on his arm, "I love thee. No kiss have I wrested from thee awake. Behold, is it for me to snatch one from thee in sleep?" He turned her face to his shoulder and touched her hair gently, winding one curl about his slender fingers. "I love thee, mate of mine. I hunger for thee, I thirst for thee. Yea, by the wind of dawn, I cannot live without thee. Behold, is there a smile lurking in the corner of thy mouth, and thine eyes, like unto clear water winding across the sands, laugh at me between thy lashes? Thou art gone but a space before me across life's desert, and I hold the hem of thy garment in my hands, so that thou canst not escape me. I hear thee calling me in the wind. I see thee beckoning me 'neath the sun." He bent and kissed her hair, then looked up to the sun, to the heavens, to that which awaited him. He raised his spear above his head and smiled. The men, racing towards him in a great circle, raised their spears and shouted a salutation as they pulled their horses back upon their haunches. He shifted the girl a little upon his left arm, then threw back his head and shouted the battle cry, shouted until the desert rang with a triumphant cry as the men, divining his intention, charged down upon him. He shook the spear above his head and laughed. "Zarah, my woman, Zarah, I follow thee." He shouted the words, shouted with joy, then drove the spear deep down into his faithful heart. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Zarah the Cruel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest. Epilogue. The holy man, motionless, gaunt, his eyes filled with the peace of Allah, the one and only God, stood afar off, outlined against the blazing sky. He looked to the north, where had passed a party of Bedouins, with a white man and a white woman in their midst, a white woman with eyes like stars of happiness and hair like unto a golden flower. He looked to the east, where passed a body of men, driving their horses at greatest speed as they rode silently, swiftly into the unknown, with the lance at rest. Leaderless they rode, a black line across the limitless, relentless desert, their spear points glittering in the sun. They faded into the distance. They were gone. To the south lay the holy man's path, the south where the wind blows hottest, where the sands burn the sandal from off even holy feet, which search salvation in distress throughout the years, and deliver them from evil. He leant upon his staff, older by some score years than when he stood to watch two horsemen fleeing for their lives across the desert. The beads of Mecca slipped between his fingers as he bent to read the inscription from the Koran, which the patriarch had roughly scratched with a spear point upon the sand. He lifted up his voice in the wilderness above the spot where Zarah the Arabian, wrapped in her great white cloak, lay upon Al-Assad's heart, asleep beneath the sands of the desert to which they both belonged. Quote, "For whomsoever thou shalt deliver from evil, on that day on him wilt thou have mercy, and this will be great salvation." End quote. The wind from the south carried the sonorous word from the Koran up to heaven as the holy man passed on the one solitary figure moving in the relentless desert, the forcing ground of hate and fear and revenge, the burial place of love and hope and peace, above which the birds of prey wheeled and called as they drifted to the north and the south, the east and the west, as they have drifted since the day every grain of sand was numbered. End of Epilogue. End of Zarah the Cruel by Joan Conquest.